Chapter 961. The Grand Court Conference was coming to an end. Too many things had happened in this year's Grand Court Conference. It was full of twists and turns. The unsolved case from more than 20 years ago, the conviction of the Chui family, the mystery of the origin of the eldest princess and Prince Li Xian, the confirmation of the position of the East Palace, and the future situation in the imperial court. The crown prince had been crowned, the country was stable, the eldest princess assisted the government, and the imperial court was stable. All the unstable factors in the past 4 years of Jing He had been cleared today. There was no doubt that from the 5th year of Jing He, the Jing kingdom would open a new era that had never been created by previous emperors. The last item of each year's Grand Court Conference was the reward for the meritorious officials in the past year. The Jing kingdom was now in full swing of the reform, and many of the measures had achieved initial results. The eldest princess was good at using people, and she specialized in special tasks. In the past year, outstanding talents emerged in all fields, so that the last item of the Grand Court Conference lasted half an hour longer than that of the previous years. Many people received generous rewards. The imperial court no longer promoted nobility, but many people were promoted to official positions. Among them, the reward for County Marquis Li was only a few words, and it was not generous. But people were not surprised about it. In the past year, County Marquis Li did not do anything earth-shattering as usual. That was because his actions had already seeped into all aspects. Up until now, in the imperial court, everyone knew that the Jing kingdom's current progress was mostly due to the eldest princess, and he was the person who stood behind the princess. Almost every decree and action of the princess had his shadow behind it. He had made great contributions, but he did not need to be rewarded. In terms of title, he was already a marquis at a young age. One more step was the limit that a foreign official could reach. In terms of official position, he was already a minister of the imperial court, a third-rank official. Although it was a nominal title, he had real power. In terms of relationship, he was the most favored official of the emperor. As long as the emperor was still alive, no one could touch him. The current crown prince, the future emperor, was his best friend. The officials could not imagine how close they were. The current princess, whose status was only below that of the crown prince, had always had an unclear relationship with him. Who was in front of whom, who was behind whom, who was at the top and who was at the bottom, these kinds of questions, in fact, could not be said clearly. He no longer needed to raise his status through promotions. Such a person had long since become a mountain that all officials and nobles could not surpass. Li Yi did not care about these rewards at all. In fact, he did not even remember what the eunuch had just read. Old foxes, they were all old foxes. He had thought that Li Xian would become the crown prince and then inherit the throne. Who would have thought that something like this would happen? Princess Emingsu had become Princess Emingsu again. Furthermore, she was assisted by Princess Emingsu. What was the difference between this and the past? With Li Xian's temperament, how could he sit still in that position? Even if he were to become the emperor, he would have enough authority to open the door for the Science Academy. He would definitely throw all the political affairs of the court to Emingsu. Anyway, wasn't there an imperial edict? Who was in charge and who was in charge? There was no clear boundary between them. The imperial court meeting was about to end, and only the final ceremony was left. Some of the officials clearly still held quite a bit of resentment toward County Marquis Li. This matter was originally very vague, and no one knew what His Majesty was thinking. Before the imperial court session, they didn't dare to take any rash actions. However, just because County Marquis Li had beaten up Prince Xan and accepted Prince Qi's gift, some people clearly stood on Prince Qi's side. In the end, Prince Qi lost his footing, and they fell miserably as well. Li Yi felt depressed to begin with. Sensing the gazes from the side, he turned his head and said fiercely, "What are you looking at? If you continue looking, I'll dig out your eyeballs." That official's body trembled, and he immediately retracted his neck. After all, the other party had already become the existence with the most profound background in this dynasty. Even the princes could not afford to offend him, let alone them. After the imperial court meeting ended, most of the officials who had come from afar would also go and check on their connections, staying until after the Lantern Festival. The matter of setting up the crown prince wasn't just to be discussed in the imperial court. Such a major matter of the country should be announced to the world. Notices were pasted on the palace walls and city gates. Within a short half a day, everyone in the capital knew about it. The identity of the eldest legitimate son, the secrets of the royal family, the position of the Eastern Palace. These were all topics that the commoners were extremely interested in. Li Yi appeared to be a little dispirited. Right now, the situation was set. Li Xian was in charge, and Emingzu was in charge. There was no one in the entire Jing kingdom who could stop them from doing what they wanted to do. Without any obstacles or enemies, he seemed to have nothing else to do. He had no interest in the imperial court and did not wish to be promoted. With his business to this extent, silver was nothing more than a number to him. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was standing at the peak of his life. If he were to go further up, he might only be able to pull Li Xian down from his position and take it himself. However, this was too easy for him. He didn't consider it. By the way, he also promised Rui that he would go to the Wu kingdom to see her little disciple, and he couldn't go alone. In the past few years, he had been really tired of staying in the capital. He would take Rui and the others to travel around and see the world. Of course, before that, he had to at least marry Zuemo in a dignified manner, and then Ruoqing. He took back what he had said just now. He still had things to do. Xiao Huan, from the morning until now, he had only eaten a bowl of porridge and was a little hungry. Li Yi habitually called Xiao Huan a few times, only to realize that Xiao Huan, Rui, and Zuemo had gone out in the morning. During the New Year festival, there were some inevitable gatherings and social engagements. In the past, it was Rui who brought Xiao Huan along. As the second madam of the Li family, Zuemo naturally had to go with them this year. Li, what's the matter? Xiao Huan didn't agree, but saw Xiao Zhu running out of the room. Go and tell the kitchen to make a few dishes and bring a pot of grape wine. Okay, I'll go now. Xiao Zhu responded and ran back in a hurry. Li Yi was startled and reminded her, the kitchen is outside, you're running in the wrong direction. In a clean and tidy room, a beautiful woman sat at the table, slowly flipping through the pages of a book. Sister Ruoqing. The sound of light footsteps came from the door, and the young girl knocked on the door and walked in. Ruoqing put down the book, turned to look at her, and asked, "What's wrong?" Xiao Zhu rolled her eyes and said, Li is hungry. He said he wants to eat the food cooked by Miss. Ruoqing got up and walked over, pinched her nose, and said, he wouldn't say that, it's you who wants to eat it, right? Xiao Zhu smiled embarrassedly, and said, I'm just thinking for him, after all, he also likes to eat the food cooked by Sister Ruoqing. Ruoqing shook her head helplessly, and said, you go play by yourself for a while, I'll go cook. Xiao Zhu smiled and nodded. Watching her walk out the door, the smile on her face disappeared, and she sighed, shaking her head helplessly. My miss is really silly, and Li is also a big idiot. It's obviously a good opportunity for the two of them to be alone, but one of them is reading in the room, and the other is sitting in the yard in a daze. These two people, when will they stop worrying about me? But, if it's just eating, it seems like it's still lacking something. Yes, it's lacking grape wine. The weather is cold, and grape wine needs to be warmed before it can be drunk. The Li family has a special wine cellar. Xiao Zhu jogged over, and a servant in the room immediately said, Sister Xiao Zhu, what's the matter? In the hearts of all the servants, Miss Xiao Huan, Miss Xiao Cui, and Miss Xiao Zhu are all different from the other servant girls, and must be treated with respect. That, your master wants to drink, help me get a jug of grape wine. I'll go get it right away, Wait a minute, the servant turned around, and asked in confusion, Sister Xiaozhu, is there anything else? Xiaozhu thought for a moment and said, bring a small jug of strong wine, the strongest kind. Chapter 962. Li Xian succeeded to the throne, and Emingzu assisted him. All the external and internal crises were swept away. After the court meeting, Lu Yi submitted a report, revealing the existence of an extremely terrifying secret force near the capital. It called itself the Holy Religion, and the person who controlled this force was called the Empress. The case of the son of the former assistant minister of the Ministry of Works and the burning of Prince Axian's mansion were both the work of this force called the Holy Religion. It was still unknown whether they had committed any other crimes. As for how big this Holy Religion was and the purpose of their existence, no one knew. The court naturally attached great importance to this matter. The officials and nobles of the capital would not tolerate such an unstable factor appearing under the feet of the emperor. The determination of the court could be seen from the fact that the Secret Intelligence Office, Supreme Court, Ministry of Justice, and the two offices of the capital were investigating this case at the same time. This was also the first decree the crown prince made after he became the ruler. If the capital wanted to be stable, the holy religion must be eliminated. Of course, this matter had nothing to do with Li Yi. Li Yi had thought that he would have nothing to do for a long time. He sat in the yard and thought for a while. Only then did he realize that he didn't have to work for them anymore. He still had a lot of things to solve. It wasn't until he smelled a fragrance that he came back to his senses. Seeing Ruoqing put a few dishes on the table, he asked in surprise, these? Did you cook them yourself? In fact, this question was unnecessary. The chefs of the Li family couldn't make such delicious dishes. I have nothing to do anyway. Ruoqing smiled and put the bowl and chopsticks in front of him. Li Yi ran to the kitchen and fetched a bowl and chopsticks for her. He said, you haven't eaten either. Sit down and eat with us. Only now did he realize that Rui and Zui Mo went out today. Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui followed them. Mississippi Lu went to Lu Meng and would come back very late. Only he and Ruoqing were left at home. No, Xiao Zhu was also unnecessary. He still had a few scripts to discuss with her. He really shouldn't have wasted time in the yard just now. The dishes cooked by Ruoqing were all his favorites, which made Li Yi feel a little guilty. His taste was similar to Drunk Mo's. Both Ruoqing and Rui liked to eat lighter food. Li Yi put down his bowl and chopsticks and said, these dishes are not enough for 2 people. I'll make a few more. Ruoqing stood up and said, what do you want to eat? I'll make it. No need, no need. Li Yi waved his hand and pressed on her shoulder, asking her to sit down. I'll do it. I haven't cooked for a long time, and my hands are a little itchy. Ruoqing could only nod helplessly. Soon, Li Yi walked over with a tray. Ruoqing looked at the 3 extra dishes and a soup on the table, and her heart warmed slightly. Then she shook her head and said, there are so many dishes. The 2 of us can't finish them all. The wine is here. Xiao Zhu walked over with an exquisite wine pot in her hand and said, the grape wine has just been warmed. Ruoqing looked at her and said, Yuzhu, go to the kitchen and get a set of chopsticks. Come and eat too. Xiao Zhu looked at the delicious dishes on the table and secretly swallowed her saliva. She shook her head firmly and said, it's okay. I'm not hungry. You guys eat. After saying that, she turned and ran away quickly. Li Yi felt that all the maids he had met were very cute. Xiao Huan was like this, Xiao Chui was like this, and Xiao Zhu was also like this. It seemed that he had to care more about them in the future. Such good girls. Come, eat more of this. Have you noticed that you've lost weight recently? Li Yi first put a lot of dishes in her bowl, and then he started eating himself. At the door of the kitchen, Xiaozhu held a cold steamed bun in her hands. She fiercely took a bite and stared in a certain direction. Everyone outside is saying that Crown Prince Li Xian was the legitimate prince back then. Ruoqing suddenly raised her head and said while eating. Li nodded and said, yes, they're right. But I should call him Crown Prince Li Xian now. They also say that you and the Crown Prince and Princess are the three heroes of the capital. It's because of you that the Jing Kingdom has today. That's all nonsense. You can't take it seriously. You can't take it seriously. Ruoqing smiled and said, in the future, the Crown Prince will supervise the country and the Princess will assist him. What about you? What are your plans? Li thought for a moment and said, I don't have any plans. But when that time comes, I won't have to go through so much trouble. I can live a stable life with you for a long time. The words with you guys made Ruoqing's face turn slightly red. Was it what she yearned for? Wasn't it a peaceful and stable life? Over the past few days, she had turned around to be her best friend and turned around to be the person she loved the most. This was already the most stable and comfortable life she could imagine in her entire life. But why did she have to do all those things? She suddenly lowered her head, bit her lower lip, and said, I have a question to ask you. Li put down his chopsticks and looked at her seriously. Ruoqing was not drunk in Mo, nor was she Rui. She did not have so many tricks and thoughts. If she said she had a question to ask him, then there really was a question. She looked into Li Yi's eyes and asked, what if someone wants to take drunken Mo away and not let you live a stable life? Whoever wants to take drunken Mo, I will break his legs and sink him into the lake of the school of mathematics. What if their power is very strong? Then I will break all their legs and sink them into the lake of the school of mathematics. If one lake is not enough, I will dig another in the Academy of Sciences next door. If it is not enough, there is also the women's college next door. What if that person is Crown Prince Li Xian? Li Yi looked at her in surprise, and then said, why does Li Xian want to take drunken Mo? Although he is the Crown Prince, believe it or not, I can still beat him until even his father can't recognize him. Ruoqing was silent. Li Yi looked at her and asked, why, you don't believe me? Ruoqing smiled, looked up at him, and said, I believe you. It was not that she didn't believe him, but because she believed him too much. She believed that he could sweep away all the obstacles he encountered. She believed that he had such an ability. She believed that he could do anything for drunken Mo, just as she believed that he could do these things for her. Even if they were facing the entire imperial court, the entire world. It was precisely because she believed that she could not let him do that. Li Yi looked at her clenched fists, and a trace of worry appeared on his face. He asked, what's wrong with you? I'm fine. Ruoqing smiled and said, it's a pity that drunken Mo is not here. If she heard these words, she would be very happy. Today, Ruoqing was a little strange. Usually, she would not say such strange things. Li Yi could see that she had something on her mind, but since she did not say it, it was useless for him to ask, so he simply did not ask. It was just that in the future, he needed to pay more attention to her. Li Yi brought the warm wine over and poured a glass for her and himself. He said, it's cold outside. Drink a glass of wine to warm up your body. This is grape wine, so it won't be intoxicating. Ruoqing nodded and raised the glass. Li Yi clinked glasses with her and drank the grape wine in the glass in one gulp. Then he looked at the wine glass in his hand and said doubtfully, the grape wine today tastes a little strange, but it's quite delicious. Ruoqing only took a shallow sip and did not notice anything. She said, maybe it's because it's been warmed. Li Yi nodded and filled his glass again. He had not realized before that after the grape wine was warmed, the taste was even more mellow. In the future, he could drink it warmly. In the kitchen, Xiaozhu finished eating the cold steamed bun and poured half a bottle of grape wine into half a jar of strong wine. She dipped her chopsticks and put it in her mouth, then smacked her lips. Half a bottle of grape wine and half a jar of strong wine tasted quite good. It not only retained the sweet taste of the grape wine, but also made the wine not so strong. This was not a strong wine that intoxicated people, but it was an intoxicating grape wine. In addition, it was not the wine that intoxicated people, but the heart that intoxicated them. There was only so much she could do for them. Chapter 963. It's really strange. Li Yi put down his chopsticks and rubbed his eyebrows. Today, Ruoqing was strange, even the grape wine was strange. Usually, he didn't feel anything after drinking a whole pot, but today, his head began to feel a little dizzy after drinking half a pot. Ruoqing also put down her chopsticks, looked at him, and asked doubtfully, "What's strange?" Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Don't you feel that this wine is a little strange?" Ruoqing shook her head. She only drank 2 cups and didn't feel anything unusual. I'm full. I'll go back to my room and rest for a while. It was nothing to drink poorly, but it was a bit shameful to get drunk after drinking grape wine. Li Yi stood up, but his body couldn't help shaking. Ruoqing hurriedly stood up, supported him, and asked worriedly, "Is there anything wrong with your body?" Li Yi shook his head. "I just feel a little dizzy. I'll be fine after a sleep. Let me help you back to your room to rest." Li Yi did feel a little dizzy, but he didn't refuse. In the past, unless he drank the strongest wine, he wouldn't feel this way. Could it be that his insignificant alcohol tolerance was showing signs of regression? Ruoqing helped him back to his room and covered him with the quilt. Then she closed the door and slowly retreated. After cleaning up the mess on the table, when she returned to her room, she found that her door was closed from the inside. "Xiaozhu, are you in there?" No one would enter her room except for herself and Xiaozhu. Xiaozhu liked to sleep on her bed. In the past, when she was reading, she would sleep on her bed if she was bored. After knocking on the door several times, there was still no sound from inside. She thought that she should be asleep, so she didn't disturb her again. The door of Xiaozhu's room was locked from the outside, and the door of Zuemo's room was the same. She had to walk back to that room again. In Ruoqing's room, Xiaozhu lay on the bed, shaking her legs and murmuring, "Sister, sister, it's up to you next." In Li Yi's room, Ruoqing covered the quilt that had been kicked aside by him and slowly sat down on the bed. She lowered her head to look at this extremely familiar face, and her gaze did not shift for a long time. At the entrance of the mansion, the 2 servants of the Li family bowed and said, "Second Mississippi." Mississippi Lu walked into the courtyard and went straight to the kitchen. This was a separate kitchen in the courtyard. As usual, she found warm food. There were dishes and wine. She curled her lips. He didn't even know how much he could hold his liquor, yet he drank such a strong liquor. She picked it up and weighed it in her hand. There was only half of it left, enough for him to sleep until tomorrow morning. He picked up his chopsticks and picked up a few mouthfuls of food. Then, he picked up the wine jar and took a gulp. His brows furrowed as he looked at the wine jar in his hand, deep in thought. It wasn't hard liquor. It tasted like grape wine, but not entirely. Surprisingly, it tasted pretty good. After finishing half a jar of wine, Zhang Xian walked out of the kitchen. Seeing that the door was open, he walked over leisurely. "At this time, I don't have to go through so much trouble. I can live a stable life with you for a long time." In the room, Ruoqing stared at him for a long time. Thinking of what he had just said, a smile appeared on her face. She slowly reached out and touched his face. What she wanted to live was a stable life with him, Zuemo, and Xiaozhu. No one or anything could be an obstacle. She gently held Li Yi's hand. At this moment, the delicate temperament on her body disappeared without a trace. She leaned down and kissed him lightly on the forehead. Then, she stood up and turned around. She turned around and saw Mississippi Lou standing at the door. There was no panic or shame on her face. She walked over unhurriedly and whispered, "He's not feeling well. Let him have a good rest." After that, she walked out of the door. Mississippi Lou looked back and walked into the room. She came to the bed, lowered her head and sniffed. Her beautiful brows furrowed. Did he think he wouldn't get drunk by mixing grape wine with hard liquor? He wasn't on guard at all. Didn't he know what he looked like when he was drunk? When she saw the light lip mark on his forehead, she was infuriated. In addition to that Zuamo, there was also Miss Ruoqing, Li Emingzu, and she really wanted to cut open his chest and see how his heart was made. Why could it hold so many people? After covering him with the quilt, she was about to turn around and leave when her wrist was suddenly grabbed. "Rui, do you know that I'm very worried about you?" Mississippi Lou turned around and looked at his eyes that were still closed. At this time, she was not worried that he would lie to her. She asked with interest, "Worried about me? Worried that you can't get married?" Li murmured, "Although you are beautiful, your temper is too bad. Which man dares to marry you?" The smile on Mississippi Lou's face became even brighter. "What did you say just now? Say it again." "Don't worry." Li waved his hand casually and said, "If no one wants you in the end, don't forget that you still have me." Her wrist froze and she suddenly shook off his hand. A trace of panic appeared on her face as she looked down at him. "Don't forget that you still have me." "I don't want you either." "Ha ha ha, who told you to always beat me?" A trace of pleasure appeared on the face of Li, who was sleeping soundly. Mississippi Lou took a deep breath, turned around and strode to the door. She did not go out, but closed the door. In the courtyard, Xiao Zhu's eyes widened and the bun in her hand fell to the ground. It's over, it's over. Miss, why don't you know how to cherish it? Such a big bargain, and you just gave it to someone else, at the brothel. Miss Ruoqing. Miss, these are the new books I've collected these days. I'll give them to you later. Sister Ruoqing, last year's accounts, I've put them on your table. Wan Ruoqing nodded and smiled at everyone she met. She passed through the brothel and walked into a room. Brother Su, ask someone to move these props to the other side. All right. Brother Su, my wife is going to give birth tonight. I'll have to trouble you to help me after work. No problem, Brother Wang. Don't worry, I'll be here. Su Zheng was busy inside and outside the hall. A young girl walked in and said, Brother Su, Sister Ruoqing is looking for you. Su Zheng turned around and smiled. Got it. I'll be right there. He put down the work in his hands, washed his hands, tidied his clothes, and walked out of the door. He warmly greeted everyone he met along the way. He came to a room and lightly knocked on the door. Come in. A woman's voice came from inside the room. Su Zheng walked in and closed the door. He respectfully knelt down. What orders does Her Highness have? Wan Ruoqing looked at him and asked, how many followers of the holy religion in the Jing kingdom? Su Zheng respectfully replied, Her Highness, the foundation of the holy religion is in the Qi kingdom. There are about 100,000 followers, and there are about 10,000 followers in the Jing kingdom. Among them, there are about 300 elites who stayed in the capital to follow Her Highness. The rest are ordinary followers, and there are about 2,000 of them, the elites of the holy religion. There are more than 300 people? Her Highness, there are more than 300. It's just that most of the elites have followed another Her Highness to the Qi kingdom. The rest are all developed by me in the past 2 years, another Her Highness. Wan Ruoqing looked at him and thought for a moment. Then she said, there is only one Her Highness in the holy religion. Su Zheng was stunned. After a while, he knelt on the ground and said respectfully, "There is only one Her Highness in the holy religion." Chapter 964. Wan Ruoqing stood up, looked at him and said, "Before you recognize me as your empress, I want to make 3 rules." Su Jing said respectfully, "Your Highness, please instruct us." First, all the followers of the holy religion are not allowed to kill or do evil. Without any hesitation, Su Jing nodded and said, "I will definitely pass on Her Highness' teachings to every disciple." Second, you are not allowed to call me Empress in public. Su Jing nodded. "I will inform all the members of the church today." Third, all the followers in the capital must evacuate within 2 days. This time, a look of hesitation appeared on Su Zhang's face. "But, Your Highness, the imperial court is currently investigating the matter of our holy church. If all of our followers are evacuated, what about your safety?" Wan Ruoqing shook her head, "You don't need to worry about my safety. If there is a day when you need to worry, you can't do anything." Su Jing looked solemn, "Your Highness, you won't go with us." Wan Ruoqing smiled, "I won't go, Your Highness. If you still recognize me as your empress, do as I say." Su Zhang's face showed an extremely conflicted expression. After a moment, he bowed his head, "I will obey." "What, still no harvest?" Li Yi took a sip of grape wine, casually asked Li Xian. He looked at the clear wine in the cup, feeling strange. The grape wine that was warmed by others was completely different from the one that Xiao Zhu warmed last time. These days, he tried several methods to warm it, but they were all far from the last time. It seemed that he had to find time to ask Xiao Zhu for advice. There is no harvest, all the clues are broken. Li Xian was not in a good mood. This was the first case he handled after entering the East Palace. It was of great significance. If he messed it up, the crown prince would lose face. As the left emissary of the holy religion, Li Xian and Li Xian discussed the issues of the holy religion face to face, which made Li Yi feel a little strange. Being a spy to this extent was probably the pinnacle of what a spy could achieve. There were some clues at first, but when we followed the clues, all the people related to it had mysteriously disappeared. All the clues ended there. Li Xian shook his head and said, "It would be great if we could find their empress. She is the most important person in the holy religion." Putting aside the fact that the Taoist nun was currently in the Qi kingdom, even if she was really in the capital city, ordinary people would not be able to do anything to her. Ruoqing came over and refilled their teacups. In the past, Li Yi did not notice it, but after the busy new year, he found that there seemed to be a shortage of maids in the family. He should recruit a few more. At this time, Uncle Li came in from outside. Li Yi waved to him and said, "Uncle Li, recruit a few more maids in the next 2 days. There are not enough people in the family." Ruoqing thought for a while and suddenly said, "There is no need to go through so much trouble. There are many sisters in the brothel. They are clean and diligent. Why don't I pick a few of them and bring them here?" "That's good." Li Yi nodded. Suddenly, Li Xian thought of something and suddenly said, "Today, the secret intelligence unit caught an ordinary believer of theirs. He was originally a farmer in the suburbs of the capital city. I don't know how he became a believer of the holy religion. I don't know if we can get information about the empress from him." Ruoqing finished pouring tea and left. Li Xian took a sip of tea and stopped talking about the holy religion. He looked back and asked, "Miss Ruoqing, when do you plan to marry her?" Li Yi looked up at him and asked, "What about you? You are going to be the emperor soon, but you only have one empress. How many more do you plan to marry?" Li Xian looked at him with slight disdain. "It is enough for me to have Qin, unlike you, make a bet. Don't be too confident." Li Yi was waiting for the day when he would slap his own face. "Sure, I am not afraid of you." No one expected that there was such a huge and terrifying force under the feet of the emperor of the capital. Last time, dozens of powerful officials were kidnapped and the entire upper class of the capital was purged. With great difficulty, they finally settled down and allowed the majority of people to have a good night's sleep. In the blink of an eye, such a thing had happened. Many people, before they went to sleep, worried that someone would set them on fire after they fell asleep, or that someone would slit their throat in their sleep. The officials and nobles of the capital strongly condemned this extremely vile behavior and urged the relevant departments to solve the case as soon as possible so that the capital could see the light of day. The Ministry of Justice, the Secret Intelligence Unit, the Supreme Court, and other departments working together to solve the case were quite efficient. In addition, because the ordinary believers of the holy religion did not have a firm will, the court finally obtained a key piece of evidence. The portrait of the Empress. Whether or not the portrait was similar was not an easy task. In the vast sea of people, finding someone with a portrait was not an easy task. But at least there was a new clue, and this was already a breakthrough. Rui took Zui Mo to attend various occasions, and Mississippi Liu went to Liu Mang. These days, only he and Ruoqing were left at home. When he had nothing to do, he would sometimes play chess with her and discuss the script to kill time. Li Yi casually placed a chess piece down and muttered, "It's useless even if we find the portrait. That Taoist nun is now in the Qi kingdom. Even if we take 10,000 steps back and assume that she's in the Jing kingdom, we won't be able to capture her unless we send out a few grandmasters at the same time." Not necessarily. Ruoqing shook her head and said, "Maybe their empress is someone else. Besides the Taoist nun, who else was the empress? If Li Yi could get this wrong, wouldn't he have been kidnapped for nothing last time?" Ruoqing put down a chess piece and suddenly looked up at him. She said, "Actually, I have something to hide from you." Li Yi was shocked and asked, "Could it be that you and Zui Mo really?" Ruoqing looked at him seriously and said, "Actually, I am the empress they are talking about." Li Yi was relieved. It was not a big deal. He thought that Ruoqing and Zui Mo were hiding it from him. He looked at Ruoqing and said seriously, "Actually, I also have something to hide from you." Ruoqing looked at him. Li Yi looked at her and said slowly, "Actually, I am the left emissary of the holy religion. My status is only below the empress." "I don't even know that you are the empress," he smiled and said, "When did you learn from Zui Mo? You also like to make this kind of joke." "I am not joking." Ruoqing shook her head and said, "The holy religion only has the right emissary, not the left emissary." Li Yi put down the chess piece that he had picked up. After a moment of shock, his face showed doubt and disbelief. He asked, "What is going on?" "I don't know either." A trace of helplessness appeared on Ruoqing's face. "I don't know either. How did I become their empress?" Li Yi finally remembered something. It was something that he had almost forgotten. It was the painting that the man in blue showed him when he was brought to Shuzhou by the Taoist nun. "So, the death of Li Jianren and the burning of Prince Xian's residence were all done by them for you?" Ruoqing nodded. Li Yi suddenly smiled and shook his head. He looked at her and said, "As the empress, you don't even know how many emissaries there are in the holy religion." He turned around and opened a cabinet in the room. He took out a jade tablet and walked over to put it on the table. "I am not joking either." He looked at Ruoqing and knelt on one knee. He said solemnly, "Azure Dragon Emissary Li Yi pays his respects to the Empress." Chapter 965. The holy religion only had the right emissary, the White Tiger Emissary. Although the left emissary, the Azure Dragon Emissary had a name, there was no such person. This was what Su Jing told her when he introduced her to the matters of the holy religion. He also told her how to identify the emissaries of the holy religion. She picked up the jade token and looked at it. There were words on the front and a picture of the Azure Dragon on the back. There was a small dent in the middle. This was undoubtedly the token of the Azure Dragon Emissary of the holy religion. In other words, he did not lie to her. He really was the Azure Dragon emissary. Before he knew that she was the Empress, he was already the Azure Dragon emissary. She suddenly felt wronged. When she was the happiest and happiest, she inexplicably became the Empress of the Holy Religion. She inexplicably became the wanted criminal of the imperial court. She inexplicably became the main culprit who might implicate him and disrupt their lives. These days, she did not sleep at all. In these days, she made many important decisions in her life. She changed so much that she could not even recognize herself, because she did not know that she was not the only empress in the family. The Azure Dragon emissary of the Holy Religion was also by his side. Why didn't he say so earlier? If she knew that he was the same as her, how could these few days have happened? But the next moment, her heart was filled with joy and happiness. So he was the same as her. They were the same. She was not alone. Looking at Ruoqing, who was stunned and had a complicated expression, Li Yi waved his hand in front of her eyes. Ruoqing, Empress. Ruoqing suddenly looked up at him and said, "I want to bite you." Ah! Li Yi was stunned. At this time, Ruoqing had already stood up and walked over. She grabbed his arm and bit down. She did not bite hard, but it was not light either. After a while, she let go. 2 rows of shallow teeth marks appeared on Li Yi's arm. This was not fair. Although he did not tell Ruoqing that he was the Blue Dragon envoy, Ruoqing did not tell him that she was the Empress. Why was she the one who bit him? Forget it, I'll get my revenge later. Let's forget about it for now. We're on the same side anyway. It doesn't matter if he bites my arm or any other place. Li Yi stretched out his other hand and said, "Have you calmed down? Do you want another bite? I can't stay here anymore." This was the first time she had done this to Li Yi. She blushed and lowered her head. No. Li Yi shook his head without any hesitation. "Let me finish first." Ruoqing looked at him and said, "They have already got my portrait and should recognize me soon. At that time, you and Zumo will not be able to get away from it. Even if His Highness the Crown Prince and the Princess believe you, there are still the civil and military officials in the court and the nobles in the capital. So, I must leave." Li Yi smiled and said, "You know, the civil and military officials in the court and the nobles in the capital. I don't care about these things. I care." Ruoqing looked at him and said seriously, "Believe me, I can handle this matter." "How do you want me to believe you?" Li Yi sighed and said, "If you run far away, where can I find you?" Ruoqing shook her head and said, "I won't run far." "How can I believe you won't run far?" Li Yi shook his head. With his previous understanding of Ruoqing, in order not to affect him, she would definitely run far away. Although he was a little surprised that she told him this time, it was better to be safe than sorry. Ruoqing suddenly took a step forward and gently hugged him. She put her cheek on his chest and whispered, "Because I like you. How can I bear to leave you?" Li Yi's mouth opened slightly and he was stunned in place. Was this a confession? Not counting the Tsundere Loli, this was the first time in his 2 lives that a member of the opposite sex had taken the initiative to confess. But, how could this person be Ruoqing? Shouldn't this kind of trick be used by the domineering female alliance leader or the domineering empress? Could it be that Ruoqing had successfully evolved from a passive, accepting daughter of a humble family to a domineering queen who took the initiative to attack? Li Yi reached out and hugged her. He felt an indescribable pain in his heart. Just what kind of mental journey had she experienced in these past few days for her to change so much? There was no response for a long time. Ruoqing raised her head and a trace of panic appeared in her eyes. She whispered, "Why aren't you saying anything?" Li Yi lowered his head to look at her and said, "You've said all the things I should have said. What do you want me to say?" Hugged. Outside the room, a figure hiding in the bushes clenched the binoculars in his hands and whispered, "Kiss, kiss, yeah. Success." Li Yi suddenly realized something. The empress of the holy religion was actually Ruoqing. Together with his blue dragon ambassador, this holy religion belonged to his family. Ruoqing was a queen, and so was the Taoist nun. It could be considered a tie. The White Tiger ambassador was one level lower than him, and his side was slightly better. In this case, why did most of the followers of the holy religion listen to them? This was a bit too much. No one could rob the Li family's things, not even a guru. What belonged to him had to be taken back sooner or later. Su had coveted the Taoist nun for a long time. Judging from the frequency of his second granduncle's abuse, the next time they fought, he would definitely be able to easily teach the Taoist nun a lesson. At that time, wouldn't the great holy religion be at his fingertips? As for what he would do after he got it, that would be a matter for him after he got it. With so many people, it would be convenient to start a rebellion. Of course, the Qi kingdom was too far away from here, so this matter could be discussed later. The most important thing now was that Ruoqing's identity as the empress was about to be exposed. If he really protected her at the risk of being condemned by the whole world, although it seemed very domineering, it was not the best way. The most important thing was that Ruoqing would not allow him to do that. Li Yi had always trusted her, and this time was no exception. Only now did he realize that this was what she had been worried about these days. He should have asked her earlier. It was not a big deal, and it was a good thing. If it were not for Ruoqing's sudden success in evolution, he would have almost made a fool of himself. "Husband, come and carry Dwainer. I want to change my clothes." Rui walked in with Li Duan in her arms and said to him. Li Yi reached out and took Li Duan, who was wearing thick clothes. Rui suddenly looked at his arm in surprise and asked, "What's wrong with your arm, husband? Who bit you?" Li Yi looked down and said, I bit it when I was bored." Rui looked at the row of shallow teeth marks and asked suspiciously, "You bit yourself?" "I really did bite myself." Li Yi picked up Li Duan with one hand and bit his other arm. He said, like this, the matter of holy religion was not over yet, so it was better not to complicate things at this time. Li Yi walked out of the door and rubbed his arm. When he bit just now, he had used a little too much force. The second young lady of the Lu clan brushed past him and then turned her head back. She grabbed his arm and asked, "What is this?" Her eyes inadvertently fell on his other arm. She looked at him and asked, "What is this?" Li Yi looked at the teeth marks on his arms and then looked at Mississippi Lu. He said, "You have all been out these days. I was bored at home, so I bit myself. Does it look good?" Mississippi Lu thought for a moment and pointed at the arm that Ruoqing had bitten. She said, "Bite another one for me to see. It's just beside this one. This way, my arms will not be symmetrical." "How ugly." Li Yi shook his head and looked at her. He asked tentatively, "How about I try on your arm?" Chapter 966. If you don't want to try, then don't try. Why are you looking at me like that? When she was young, she often left bite marks on her wrist and then used a ballpoint pen to draw on the hands to make it look like a wristwatch. It was normal for her to bite herself. Ignoring the second miss, he walked back to his room and saw Xiao Zhu and Xiao Chui playing in the yard. Li Yi stopped. After some thought, he waved her over. "Xiao Zhu, come here. I want to ask you something, a government office somewhere in the capital." Several officials in charge of the holy religion case were gathered together. They looked at a portrait spread on the table, frowning. Li Xian walked in from outside. He glanced at everyone and asked, "What did you see? Tell me." This case had been dragged on for a long time. It had used up what little patience he had. He was still waiting for the case to end so he could discuss a scientific problem with Shinshu. Speaking of which, it had been a long time since he had seen Shinshu. The Supreme Court official said helplessly, "Your Highness, let's not talk about the authenticity of this portrait for now. It will be difficult for us to find the Empress with just this portrait. This portrait has been plastered all over the streets and alleys of the capital, but we haven't found anything yet." On the other side, Governor Lu Dio was deep in thought. He felt that he had seen the Empress in this portrait before, but he couldn't remember where he had seen her before. Annoyed, he picked up the file again and flipped through it. "All right, hurry up." Li Xian waved his hand. Just as he was about to walk out, he glanced at the portrait on the table and stopped. He walked back and looked at the portrait on the table in a daze. Lu Dio put down the files of the two cases. As if realizing something, he walked over quickly and looked at the portrait on the table. The next moment, Li Xian put the portrait away. "Your Highness, you." The officials were confused. "I will take this portrait back and study it carefully. You are dismissed." He waved his hand, picked up the portrait, and left. All of the officials looked at each other in dismay. There was only a single original painting of the Heavenly Empress and they couldn't even find the person based on the original painting, much less the painter who had copied it. Just what did the Crown Prince want? Lu Dio walked out in a daze. He was thinking about something that he had just figured out. It turned out that Li Jianren's death and the burning of Prince Axian's manor were not unrelated. Li Jianren wanted to harm Miss Ruoqing, so the people of Holy Religion sent him straight to hell. Prince Axian burned down Miss Ruoqing's residence. Therefore, his Prince Axian manor was also burned down by the people from the Holy Religion. These two seemingly unrelated cases were closely linked because of one person. Only, Miss Ruoqing was the Empress. How was this possible? Li Yi took a sip of wine and decided to promote Xiao Zhu to be his personal wine warmer in the future. The grape wine that she warmed tasted different from others. It was at this moment that the slightly absent-minded Li Xian walked in from outside. Li Yi poured him a cup of wine and said, "What's wrong? Isn't Emingzu the one handling the matters of the court? Why do you look so glum?" After Li Xian sat down, he sighed and handed the portrait to him. Li Yi opened the portrait and stood up abruptly, glaring at him and saying loudly, "Speak. Why is Ruoqing's portrait with you? You already have the Crown Prince's consort and Shinshu. Could it be that you still have designs on her? Are you still human?" The drawing skills of this portrait were not very good and ordinary people might not be able to recognize it. However, how could he not recognize it after spending so much time with Ruoqing? Shinshu. Li Xian was startled. "That's not important." Li Yi waved his hand. "Why do you have Ruoqing's portrait?" Li Xian shook his head and looked at him, saying, "This portrait is of the Empress of the Holy Religion." Li Yi looked at the portrait again and asked, "Did you take the wrong one? There are people who look so similar in this world." At this moment, Fong hurriedly ran in from outside and said anxiously, "Son-in-law, bad news. Miss Ruoqing has disappeared." Li Yi was startled. Although Ruoqing did not tell him her plan, he did not need to worry about Ruoqing leaving. Pretending to be surprised, he asked, "What happened?" The people who were protecting Miss Ruoqing were all knocked unconscious. When they woke up, Miss Ruoqing had disappeared. Fong anxiously said, "Son-in-law, don't worry, I have already sent people to look for her." Li, bad news. Xiao Zhu frantically ran out from Ruoqing's room and handed a letter to Li Yi. Wiping away her tears, she said with a sobbing voice, Miss has left." Li Yi opened the letter. In the letter, she explained in detail how she became the Empress. Although this was not her original intention, in order to not implicate him and the Li family, the best way was for her to leave. Li Yi put down the letter and slowly sat down. After Li Xian looked over, his complexion changed. He shook his head and said, I didn't know. If I knew, I wouldn't have let them investigate. Xiao Zhu hugged Li Yi's arm and said with a sobbing voice, Li, what do we do? What do we do now? A servant of the Li family came over and said in a low voice, Marquis, a lord from the Ministry of Justice has come to visit. Li Yi waved his hand, let him in. Greetings to your highness, greetings to Lord Li. An official from the Ministry of Justice came in and respectfully bowed. Li Xian was annoyed. He glanced at him and asked, what's the matter? The official looked up and said in a low voice, Your Highness, our people have just found the identity of the woman in the portrait. However, the Empress and County Marquis Li, what do you mean? Li Xian said coldly with a sullen face, what are you people from the Ministry of Justice doing? If he says it's the Empress, then it's the Empress. Can't you use your brain to think about it? Go back and investigate it seriously. After being scolded by the Crown Prince, the official from the Ministry of Justice could only nod his head in agreement and leave helplessly. Li Xian looked at Li Yi and said worriedly, Don't worry, I will order people to find Miss Ruoqing. Li Yi waved his hand, no need. In any case, she is the Empress of the Holy Religion, no. Li Xian shook his head repeatedly, didn't you say last time that the Empress of the Holy Religion is that Taoist nun? How can there be two empresses? What happened to Miss Ruoqing was a misunderstanding. I will order the Taoist nun to be wanted in the whole Jing kingdom. Li Yi shook his head and said no more. Li Xian said solemnly, I will go back and order it now. Li Xian still had a worried look on his face when he left the Li residence. At this time, the holy religion was not the thing he was worried about. Miss Ruoqing had left. According to Li Yi's character, he would not let it go. If he left with her, there would be no meaning in the capital. In the yard, Fong looked at Li Yi who was calmly drinking grape wine and asked, Young master, Miss Ruoqing is the Empress of the Holy Religion. Aren't you surprised? Putting aside the fact that Miss Ruoqing had suddenly become the Empress, she had disappeared just like that. Young master's reaction should not be like this. So what if Ruoqing is the Empress? Li Yi looked at him and said, I'm also the Azure Dragon envoy of the Holy Religion. Have I ever shown off before? The matter regarding the Holy Religion, which had caused a great commotion in the past few days, had yet to subside when another wave of commotion broke out in the capital. Prince Axian, who had already left the capital, had met with a group of thugs on his way to his feudal land. Not only had his group been robbed, but even Prince Axian had been beaten up by them. Therefore, Prince Axian, who had just left the capital, was carried back again. It was verified that the group of thugs were the believers of the Holy Religion. Although Prince Axian had met with an unexpected misfortune, those people had at least left the capital. While strict orders were given to investigate those thugs, all the influential officials in the capital were finally at ease. They had finally left. As for whether the Empress of the Holy Religion was the Taoist nun who was wanted or someone else, or whether she was related to County Marquis Li, the imperial court had not come to a conclusion. They could not tell if it was real or fake either. However, since the Crown Prince and the Princess did not care, they could not say anything else. It was fine as long as they were no longer threatened by those people in the future. Although the Ministry of Justice and the other government offices had investigated some things, they were unable to verify that the lady had disappeared from the capital. The Crown Prince had the intention to close the case and had even given them a death order. To them, this was also a good thing. Who would dare to go to County Marquis Li's place to investigate the case? Li Manor, drunken Amo looked at Li Yi and asked with a burning gaze, where on earth did Sister Ruoqing go? Li Yi shook his head and said, I really don't know. A few days ago, her portrait was pasted all over the capital. She definitely can't appear now, you must know something. Drunken Mo's expression was one of disbelief. She shook her head and said, if Sister Ruoqing really went missing, you'll go crazy from anxiety. How would you be in the mood to drink grape wine here? Look into my sincere eyes. Li Yi held her face and looked at her, saying, I'm not lying to you. I really don't know where she is. Drunken Mo pushed his hand away, feeling less nervous. Although she was still very curious as to why Sister Ruoqing had become the Empress, what was more important was that she was safe and sound. It was because if something were to really happen to her, a certain someone would be much more anxious than her. Li Yi saw Uncle Li walking past in a hurry and asked, Uncle Li, where are you going? Caretaker Li came back and stood at the door, saying, Didn't young master say that there's a lack of manpower at home and that you need to pick a few more maids? Miss Ruoqing picked a few from the brothel. Now that they're all here, I'll go take a look. Chapter 967. Compared with powerful officials of the same level, the Leaf family did not have many servants. This was because all the masters in the family did not have the habit of having servants serve them. However, there were still maids who were responsible for cleaning the room and serving tea to the guests. Ever since Zumo and Ruoqing moved in, the family seemed to be lacking in manpower. Before Ruoqing left, he picked a few diligent sisters from the brothel who had clean backgrounds. He knew them well and did not have to worry about anything else. Butler Li stood in the yard and looked at the few women standing in a row. He said solemnly, This is the marquis of our family. Open your eyes and look carefully. Don't mistake the master in the future. I will take you to see Madam later. He and Rui didn't usually scold the servant girls. Uncle Li was the one who played the role of the bad guy. In his words, servants should act like servants. Even if the master was benevolent, the servants couldn't know what was good for them. The new maids needed to establish their authority. After saying this with a straight face, Uncle Li waved his hand and said, Okay, starting from the far left, introduce yourselves one by one. My name is Xiao Qiu, a maid said timidly. My name is Xiao Rong. Another maid stood up. I am Xiao Rou. I am Xiao Dai. There were a total of 5 maids who entered the mansion this time. They would be taken to see Rui and Zumo later. Li Yi's gaze swept over them and moved to the last woman in white. The woman smiled and bowed slightly to him. Xiao Qing greets the marquis. Uncle Li turned around and said with a smile, Young master, I will take them to see Madam and second Madam. Wait, I still lack someone to grind ink in my study. Li Yi thought for a moment and looked at the maids again. He pointed casually and said, Xiao Qing. Uncle Li looked at him in surprise. Young master's study had long been taken over by the second miss, and the thing he usually did was bask in the sun in the courtyard. It was understandable that he lacked a servant girl to massage his shoulders and legs, but what kind of ink was he grinding for? However, the entire Li family was his. It was naturally not a problem to have a maid. Uncle Li looked at her and said, Xiao Qing, then you will follow the marquis from now on. The woman lowered her head and bowed again. Yes. This winter, it was likely that it would not snow at all. As the Lantern Festival approached, the weather began to warm up. By noon, there was not much chill. Yongning and Shanning took off their thick fur coats and played on the lawn. Li Yi sat to the side and leisurely roasted meat. The two finally got tired of playing and ran over to crouch beside Li Yi. They swallowed as they watched the golden oil drip onto the charcoal, making a sizzling sound. This is not normal. This is definitely not normal. Li Xian stood far away and looked at this scene. The worry on his face deepened. Mingzu turned to look at him and asked, How is it not normal? Miss Ruoqing has disappeared for 3 whole days. Li Xian counted with his fingers and looked at Li Yi. How can he be so calm and still have the mood to sit there and roast meat, and still have the mood to feed Shanning? Is this not good? Mingzu looked at him and asked, Do you want him to be depressed? Li Xian shook his head and said, Have you heard of an old saying? What old saying? Mingzu looked at him and asked, What old saying? Li Xian said in a low voice, if you don't explode in silence, you will perish in silence. Mingzu looked at him in confusion. Which ancient person said this? Lu Sun. Who is Lu Sun? The writer, thinker, and educator that Li Yi mentioned last time. Don't worry about who Lu Sun is. Li Xian shook his head and said, don't be fooled by his smile on the surface. Maybe in his heart. In short, he is very dangerous. The calmer he appears, the more dangerous he is. Then what is normal for him to do? Look for him. Li Xian said anxiously, he should be more anxious than anyone else. He has been looking for you all over the world. It's impossible for him to be as calm as he is now. Think about it. If you are lost, what will he do? When you go there later, don't mention misruaching, and don't mention holy religion. Li Xian said and then walked quickly. Let me do it. Li Xian snatched the iron skewer from Li Yi's hand and said, you rest. I will roast it for a while. He didn't expect the crown prince to be so diligent. Li Yi handed the iron skewer to him and took a chicken wing for himself. Just now, he was focused on feeding the two greedy cats and didn't eat much. Put it down and don't move. Li Xian snatched the iron skewer from his hand and put the chicken wing on the plate with chopsticks. He said, it's more convenient to eat like this. Li Yi looked at him and suddenly asked, do you have something to ask of me? Li Xian shook his head violently. No. Really, you only have this one chance. I really don't. Li Yi shook his head. He didn't know what was wrong with him today. Just in case, it was better to stay away from him. After eating the chicken wing, he walked straight to the pavilion in the middle of the lake. The weather was good today. On his way back, he would catch 2 fish, one in soup and one in braising. Li Xian finished roasting the fish. When he turned around, he found that Li Yi was no longer by his side. He looked back and said in shock, Mingzu, stop him. He wants to jump into the lake. This is why I changed my clothes when I came back. Li Yi explained to Rui, Mississippi Lu, and Drunk Ink. After all, the clothes he wore when he came back were different from when he went out. It was Mingzhu's clothes. It would indeed cause a big misunderstanding. Those who didn't know better would think that he had done something dirty. It was just that when he was fishing, he subconsciously dodged Mingzhu's grasp. In the end, the fish ran away, and he fell into the lake. The lake water at this time of year was piercingly cold. If it weren't for Mingzhu bringing him a new set of clothes from the women's college next door, he would probably be frozen sick today. Of course, many of her clothes were gender-neutral, so he didn't look so out of place when he wore them. Although he had changed his clothes, he still looked a little disheveled. Rui helped him take off his coat and said, I've asked Xiao Huan to boil the water. Husband, go take a hot bath first. The lake water was dirty. It was time for a good bath. Although he was wearing Mingzhu's clothes on the outside, his underwear was still wet. Soaking comfortably in the bathtub, the water vapor rose. Li Yi closed his eyes, and the remaining chill immediately disappeared. The door creaked and slowly closed. Someone added hot water to the bathtub. Li Yi said, help me massage my shoulders. The figure who was about to walk out of the door stopped in his tracks. Not long after, a pair of soft hands were placed on his shoulders. The hands moved slowly on his shoulders. At a certain moment, Li Yi said, Xiao Huan, you don't need to massage here. Just massage the previous place. I don't know where Miss Xiao Huan used to massage before. Hearing the voice behind him, Li Yi opened his eyes and turned his head. He said in surprise, Ruo. Xiao Qing, why are you here? The woman behind him smiled a little embarrassedly. Dwainer was making a fuss. Xiao Huan went to comfort him and asked me to come and add water for her. Chapter 968. Xiao Huan, what's wrong? Did someone bully you? Xiao Huan had been listless for the past 2 days. Today, in half a day, Li found that she was in a daze 3 times. When she sat alone at the stone table in the courtyard, Li walked over and sat opposite her, asking with concern. No, Xiao Huan shook her head. She could not say that it was because the servant girl called Xiao Qing was too diligent and took away all the work that was supposed to be done by her. Moreover, the son-in-law seemed to treat that Miss Xiao Qing differently. This was the first time he allowed another servant girl to grind the ink for him, and also the first time he allowed another servant girl to rub his shoulders when he was bathing. These things were all done by her in the past. Li Yi looked at her and said in disbelief, "Really?" The servant girl twisted her fingers together and looked at him pitifully. She asked, "Son-in-law, do you not like Xiao Huan anymore?" Li Yi did not know what the servant girl was thinking. Surprised, he got up and sat beside her. Pinching her face, he asked, "Who said that? Who said son-in-law doesn't like Xiao Huan?" The servant girl said pitifully, "But son-in-law doesn't need Xiao Huan to grind the ink, he doesn't need Xiao Huan to bathe." Li Yi then knew that she was actually jealous of Ruoqing. Ruoqing's identity as the Empress of Heaven had already been exposed. Although Li Xian did not let those people investigate further, but if she appeared in the capital with her original appearance, there would still be some trouble. So she ordered most of the followers of the holy religion to leave the capital, creating the illusion that the Empress of Heaven had already left the capital. Then, she disguised herself as a servant girl and came back without anyone knowing. Not to mention the other things of the holy religion, but the level of disguise, Li Yi himself had a deep understanding. With a mask on, even one's own parents would not be able to recognize it. Of course, he couldn't be more familiar with Ruoqing. This familiarity didn't just come from her face. On the first day he entered the mansion, he had recognized her at first sight. Knowing that she was Ruoqing, she naturally could not treat her like an ordinary servant girl, so she specially arranged for her to stay by her side, and arranged a room for her alone. Who would have thought that such a little difference would actually be discovered by Xiao Huan? Li Yi pulled her over and asked with a smile, "Are you jealous of little Qing?" The little maid sniffled. "Of course not." Li Yi leaned close to her ear and whispered a few words. Xiao Huan's eyes suddenly widened. She said in disbelief, "How is this possible? How could Xiao Qing be? Have you forgotten that the son-in-law also has a mask like that?" Xiao Huan was startled. Her face revealed a look of realization, and then she became a little embarrassed. If little Qing was Miss Ruoqing, then it wouldn't be a problem. Why would it be a problem if it was Miss Ruoqing? Even she couldn't understand it herself. If he didn't explain it clearly to Xiao Huan, who knew what she would think? The Li family was so big, and there were so many people. This matter, Li Yi didn't even have the time to tell Rui. If he showed any abnormalities, Ruoqing's efforts would be in vain. "Second madam, what's the matter?" The new servant girl of the Li family walked into a room and asked the woman in the room. Drunk Ink looked up at her and said, "It's nothing much. I heard that little Qing is good at grinding ink. I was just about to write a few words and wanted to ask for your help." Little Qing walked to the desk and said with a faint smile, "This is what I should do." There were not only the two of them in the room. When she was grinding ink, little Zhu sat on the other side of the desk with one hand under her chin, murmuring, "Where did Sister Ruoqing go?" Little Cui jeered at the side, "It must be that Sister Ruoqing thinks you are too annoying and doesn't want you anymore. Say it again. What's wrong with saying it again?" "You are just annoying." The two little servant girls quickly began to quarrel. Drunk Ink ignored them and looked at little Qing who was grinding ink. She asked, "Where is little Qing from?" "She grew up in the capital." Drunk Ink shook her head and said, "Little Qing is very much like a good friend of mine, but she grew up in Qing and Prefecture and only came to the capital 2 years ago." Little Qing smiled and did not speak. Drunk Ink asked again, who else is in the family? Little Qing replied, only me. The two of them chatted like this. Not long after, Little Qing put down the ink and said, Second madam, the ink is ready. If there is nothing else, I will go down first. Drunk Ink crossed her arms and looked at her, asking, How long are you going to pretend for? Little Qing looked surprised and asked, Second madam, what are you talking about? Drunk Ink suddenly hugged her and put her hands on her chest. This is the feeling. Do you still want to pretend? Ruoqing's face was red and she hurriedly said, Drunk Ink, what are you doing? Let go of me. At this moment, her voice was very different from before. Not calling me second madam now. Drunk Ink looked at her with a proud expression and said, Little Chui, close the door. Hearing the young Miss's order, Little Chui immediately ran over and closed the door. Ruoqing's expression finally became flustered and she hurriedly said, Drunk Ink, what are you going to do? Don't do anything stupid. Drunk Ink looked at her and snorted. You even dare to lie to me, of course you will be punished according to the family rules. Hearing the words, family rules, Ruoqing's face became even redder. She looked at Little Zhu and said anxiously, Yuzhu, come help me. Little Zhu rolled up her sleeves and ran over, asking excitedly, Sister Drunk Ink, how do you want me to help you? Ever since Li Duan could walk steadily, he liked to walk, and Rui did not have to watch him all the time. Now it was approaching the Lantern Festival. For the Li family, the most important day of this month was not the Lantern Festival, but the happy event of welcoming Drunk Ink into the family at the end of the month. Rui handed over a booklet and said, This is the guest list written by Old Madam. Husband, take a look and see if anyone is missing. It's time to have someone write an invitation. Old Madam is familiar with this kind of thing. I don't think she will miss anyone. Li Yi looked at it and put it aside. Rui looked at him and asked again, Miss Ruoqing is gone. Husband, are you really not going to look for her? Li Yi was actually about to tell her about this matter, but he did not expect Rui to speak first. He said awkwardly, You may not know, but actually, Little Qing is Miss Ruoqing. Unlike what Li Yi had imagined, Rui's face did not show much surprise. She looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, I thought husband would hide this matter from me for a few more days. Li Yi said in surprise, Wife, you know all about it. There are many ways to tell a person apart from their appearance. Figure, behavior, aura. Rui looked at him and said, Judging people by their appearance is the worst way. Li Yi explained, Ruoqing's identity is special. If others know, it will be troublesome. I don't blame husband. I know all this. Rui leaned on his shoulder and asked softly, But I don't know how many good sisters I have. Li Yi said in surprise, Wife, don't you only have one sister, Rui? Including Xiao Huan, there are only two. Rui shook her head and said, Other than Rui and Xiao Huan, there are also Sister Zumo, Sister Ruoqing, Sister Emingzu, and Sister Lin from the Qi Kingdom. It depends on husband whether there are any Sister Lin, Li Yi shuddered. He thought that spring was coming, but at this moment, he felt that the weather was getting colder and colder. The weather was getting colder. Keep warm and avoid catching a cold. Chapter 969. Never underestimate a woman. If she had the identity of a grandmaster in addition to being a woman, then she should not be underestimated even more. This was what Li Yi had learned from his own experience. In fact, I have long known about Miss Ruoqing's feelings for my husband. Rui leaned against his chest and said, In the past few years, from Qing and prefecture to the capital, such a large brothel has been taken care of by a woman. I can imagine how hard she has worked. If it were not for the fact that she already loves my husband to the bone, which woman would be willing to do this for a man? She does not want to be the empress who is respected by all. She only wants to be the little Qing who follows my husband. How can I not see it? There are not many women in the world who value affection and righteousness so much, but my husband has met all of them. Why is my husband so lucky? I want to bite you. Ruoqing's identity was no longer a secret to Rui and the others. But in the mansion, she still called herself Little Qin, and did all the things that a servant girl should do. After all, her other identity was a little too shocking. There was a bite mark of love on his neck in exchange for Rui's acknowledgement of Ruoqing. No matter how broad-minded Rui was, it was impossible for her to remain calm from beginning to end in this kind of thing. So when she proposed that good things come in pairs, and let drunken Mo and Ruoqing enter the Leaf family at the same time, he did not agree. It was better to take this matter step by step. While eating, Mississippi Lu, who was sitting next to him, glanced at him and asked, "What's wrong with your neck?" Drunken Mo also looked over with a puzzled expression. Li Yi looked at Rui. Rui's pretty face was slightly red. She lowered her head and bit her chopsticks, and at the same time, gave him a threatening look. Li Yi swallowed the words he was about to say. Rui's threat was much more useful than Mississippi Lu's. Before Zuamo and Ruoqing married into the Leaf family openly, ignoring Rui's threat, he could only stay alone in the room at night. He would rather offend Mississippi Lu than Rui. He picked up a mouthful of food, touched the bite mark on his neck, and said casually, "Oh, you mean this?" I had nothing better to do, so I bit it randomly. Xiao Huan put down her chopsticks and twisted her head to see if she could bite her own neck. Mississippi Lu also put down her chopsticks and looked at him with her arms crossed. "Take another bite and we'll see." Li Yi asked in surprise, "Here?" Mississippi Lu nodded. "Right here." Li Yi thought about it and said, "All right then." Seeing this, Xiao Huan immediately turned her head, wanting to see how her son-in-law could do this action that she could not do. Li Yi rinsed his mouth and then looked at Mississippi Lu. To be precise, he stared at her snow-white neck and asked, "Have you washed your neck?" Too many things had happened in the 4th year of Jing He. The fall of the Cui family, the loss of power of the king of Shu, and a large number of forces in the capital had suffered a bloody purge. Some families fell, and others stood up. The current situation in the capital and even in the Jing kingdom had been very stable. The people's hearts and the imperial court had stabilized. Although Li Xian had just succeeded the throne, he had a high reputation in the imperial court. With Mingzhu's assistance, he could easily stabilize the general situation. From the moment they stepped here, the turbulent capital began to calm down. After observing for several days, Li Xian finally confirmed that the incident did not seem to have much effect on Li Yi. Not only that, the entire Li family seemed to be exactly the same as before. Even the servant girl called Xiao Zhu did not seem to feel anything about her mistress's departure. When she brought the wine over, she was smiling like a flower. This made him feel relieved, but also puzzled. Based on his understanding of Li Yi, he could not be so calm at this time. Li Xian looked at him and asked suspiciously, "Did you hide Miss Ruoqing?" Li Yi drank a cup of warm grape wine and shook his head. "No." Li Xian looked at the servant girl who was pouring wine for Li Yi and suddenly said in surprise, "Your servant girl looks unfamiliar. Is she new?" He waved his hand and said, "Don't just look at the marquis. I've run out of wine, why don't you pour it?" "Pour what?" Li Yi slapped the table and glared at him. "If you want to drink, pour it yourself. Don't you have hands?" Li Xian looked at him in a daze, and then looked at the servant girl standing to the side. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a moment, he stared at Li Yi. "You even hid it from me." Li Yi poured more wine for him. "If other people knew, you would be the one in trouble. But you're Ruoqing, is she really the empress of the holy religion?" The dissatisfaction on Li Xian's face instantly disappeared. He asked with some excitement, "Is it like what she said in the letter?" "Correct." Li Yi nodded. "Tell me, is there such a possibility? Li Xian looked at him, thought for a moment, and said, now there are two empresses of the holy religion. If we make Taoist none, he made a throat-slitting gesture and murmured, then this holy religion can be used by us. Didn't you say that the holy religion has 100,000 believers in the Qi kingdom? When the time comes, we can work together. That being said, Taoist nun was a grandmaster. Even if she couldn't beat them, she could still run. Moreover, she was in the Qi kingdom, surrounded by followers, and there were many masters among them. If they really fought force with force, the current Lu Meng would not be a match for her. It would not be easy to deal with her. It was slightly more difficult. Li Yi did not accompany Li Xian in his daydreaming. He asked, how is His Majesty's health? The winter this year was unusually cold. The weather had been good for a few days, but it became gloomy again. It would not warm up before the Lantern Festival. In the past, when the weather was good, he could occasionally go to the palace to get a free meal. Now it had been a long time since he was summoned. Li Xian drank up the wine in his cup, shook his head, and said, Father now spends more time in sleep than when he is awake. The old emperor's illness worsened with the seasons, and it was getting worse year by year. This winter was long and cold, and there was no sign of it warming up. He, Li Xian, and Emingzu had tried to avoid this topic. What did the imperial doctor say? If he can survive this winter, there may be some relief, but if, before Li Xian finished his words, he fell into silence. Li Yi looked up at the sky. It was gloomy, as if the whole sky was about to press down, making it difficult to breathe. Your Highness, His Majesty summons you. A eunuch came in from outside and said respectfully, Marquis Li, His Majesty also summons you. Chapter 970. His Majesty has just woken up and is talking with Her Highness the Empress and Her Highness the Consort Yan in the hall. Wait in the side hall for a while, Changde said to Li Yi and Li Xian as he closed the door. Li Xian let out a breath and rubbed his hands together. He walked into the side hall and asked, how many times has Father woken up today? Changde said, today is the second time. He woke up for a while in the morning and went back to sleep after eating some food. After walking into the side hall, they could no longer feel the cold air outside. Yongning saw Li Yi and ran over. She accidentally tripped and fell to the ground. Li Yi quickly ran over and picked her up. He asked with concern, are you hurt? Although tears were already welling up in her eyes, she still shook her head and said in a soft voice, it's not painful. Li Yi patted away the dust on her body and held her little hand. He said, be careful when you walk in the future, okay? Yongning lowered her head and said obediently, I know. Not only was Yongning in the side hall, but Emingzu and Shanning were also there. There were also a few young princes and princesses playing in the distance. Teacher, what's wrong with Father? The proud Lolita slowly raised her head and looked at Li Yi. There was a trace of unconcealable panic in the depths of her clear eyes. Li Yi patted her head and said, His Majesty is fine. He just wants to talk to you. Don't you have many things to say to your father? Li Yi looked at Emingzu. She was sitting there with a dazed expression and her eyes were out of focus. A eunuch walked in and said softly, Your Highness the Crown Prince, eldest princess, His Majesty summons you. Li Xian and Emingzu brought Yongning, Shanning, and the group of princes and princesses into the hall. Li Yi sat alone in the side hall, staring blankly at the dancing flames in the furnace. It was quiet in the side hall. Only the crackling sound of the firewood in the stove could be heard. Li Yi's heart was also peaceful. It was so peaceful that he couldn't even hear the only sound. He had already vaguely guessed some things. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps a quarter of an hour, or perhaps an hour, Li Xian's voice rang in his ears. Li Yi looked up at him and realized that Emingzu, Yongning, and Xiaoning were already standing in front of him. Li Xian's eyes were a little red as he said in a low voice, "Father wants you to go." Li nodded, stood up, and walked out of the side hall. The cold wind blew against his face. He tightened his clothes. Changde had already opened another door and said, "Come in." When Li Yi walked into the hall, the first thing he smelled was a faint fragrance. The fragrance of white fungus and lotus seed soup. He slowly walked to the bed and bowed, "This official greets, cough, no need." A weak voice came from the bed. Emperor Jing leaned on the bed, looked at him, and asked, "Have you eaten?" "Not yet." Li Yi shook his head. It was not time to eat at this time. Emperor Jing tilted his head to look and gestured, "Then eat here." Changde, help Zhen up. A bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup that had been cooked too well, and a few simple side dishes. Although they were simple, it was very intimate. In the early years of Jing He, in Ning Wang Fu, there were also these few side dishes and a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup that had been cooked too well. Jin still remember that day when you said that you had a stubborn disease that prevented you from being an official. A eunuch at the side wanted to pick up the spoon for him. Emperor Jing waved his hand with difficulty and picked up the spoon himself. He said, "Why did Jin not punish you for deceiving the emperor at that time?" Li Yi took a sip of the soup and shook his head. He smiled and said, "One who does not know is not guilty. Moreover, if your majesty had deceived the emperor at that time, no one would have saved your majesty that night. Everything is fate." Emperor Jing nodded and said with a smile, "Pour wine for Zhen." Li Yi poured himself a cup of grape wine and shook his head. He said, "Your majesty, you have forgotten that you cannot drink wine." He took a sip of wine. Emperor Jing suddenly looked at him and asked, "Are you not afraid that the wine is poisoned?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "If your majesty wanted to poison the wine, why did you wait until today?" Emperor Jing nodded and said, "Yes, if I wanted to poison the wine, after you offered Tianfa, after you used the brothel to spread rumors to force the king of Shu to leave the capital, after you gathered the people in the martial arts world, after you used a play to destroy the literary family of the Jing kingdom, after you got rid of the Cui family, and when you wanted to help Emingzu ascend the throne, would have done it." Li Yi drank the wine in his cup and shook his head. He said, "Tianfa was what your majesty wanted. The king of Shu left the capital was also what your majesty wanted. The one who wanted to destroy the Chu family was your majesty. The one who wanted to get rid of the Cui family and support Emingzu was your majesty. I will not take the blame for this." Emperor Jing looked at him and said slowly, "In the end, you did not let Jin down." Li Yi cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for your trust, your majesty." Emperor Jing put down his chopsticks and covered his chest. After a long pause, he said, "Jin will leave soon." His tone was very calm and his expression was indifferent. It was as if he was saying something very ordinary. It was as if he was saying that he would be back soon. Just like just now, he casually asked Li Yi, "Have you eaten?" Li Yi hoped that was the case. Emperor Jing looked at Li Yi and suddenly asked, "You know everything. Can you tell Zhen where people go after they die? Is there really an underworld?" There was no fear on his face, only curiosity. "I don't know whether there is an underworld or not." Li Yi shook his head and said, "But sometimes, death is not the end, but the beginning." "What do you mean?" "It is possible that when your majesty wakes up, you will find that you are no longer in the imperial palace, not in the Jing kingdom, but in the Qi kingdom, in the Wu kingdom, or in another world. At that time, your majesty will not be like this. Perhaps you are just a baby, a naughty child, or a young man." Li Yi looked at Emperor Jing and said, "It seems difficult to understand, but a few years ago, your majesty certainly did not think that anyone could fly to the sky, right?" Emperor Jing looked at him and asked, "You mean, fly to the sky like those people in the Academy of Sciences?" Li Yi shook his head and said, they can only fly a little more than 10 feet, at most a few hundred feet. I said that people can fly thousands of feet, tens of thousands of feet, and even to the moon. At that time, from the capital to the Qi kingdom, it will not take several months, but only 1 to 4 hours. Mere mortals can also fly to the moon. Not only that, but if the sun is not too hot, mortals can even fly to the sun. Your Majesty can imagine that in the distant future, celestial punishment can raise the entire capital to the ground, making the capital region barren for 100 years. Your Majesty may also not imagine that there is a heavenly eye that allows your Majesty to see what is happening in any place in the Jin kingdom from the imperial palace. Your Majesty certainly can't imagine that one day, I can send a message to your Majesty from the Qi kingdom. There is no courier station, no messenger, and the message arrives in an instant. If your Majesty wants to destroy the capital of the Qi kingdom, you don't need to mobilize a large number of people. You only need to sit in the Yangju hall and move your finger. The eunuchs standing on both sides, including Changde, had their mouths wide open. A celestial punishment could destroy the entire capital. Mortals could fly to the moon and see the entire Jin kingdom's heavenly eye. Even from 1,000 miles away, the message arrived in an instant. Did County Marquis Li have a hysteria again? If someone else told me this, I would send him to the Imperial Physician Bureau. Emperor Jing looked at him and said, you are different. I don't trust others, but I trust you. It's a pity that I won't be able to see this day. He sighed with regret on his face. Then he said, Changde, call Xian, and Emingzu to come here. Changde walked out of the hole. He turned around and took out a small wine pot from the quilt. He smiled and said, Xianing understands me the best. He poured a cup of wine for himself. Li Yi did not stop him. Emperor Jing took a sip and closed his eyes. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes and said, after I leave, please take care of Emingzu and Xian. Li Xian and Emingzu walked in. Emperor Jing slowly stood up and held their hands. Then he looked at Li Yi and said with a smile, I hand over the world to you. Chapter 971. Today was the 15th day of the first lunar month. The capital was getting more and more prosperous every year. It was just past noon, but the streets in the city were already crowded. The Li family. Xiao Huan poked her head out of the kitchen and said, Young master, I want to eat sesame filling. Second miss also wants to eat sesame filling. The small kitchen was not big to begin with. Li Yi was making yuanxiao, Ruoqing was helping by the side, the proud Lolita was helping on the other side, and Yongning was running around. The place was a bit crowded. Even if the others wanted to help, they could not come in. Li Yi waved his hand to indicate that he understood. Yongning approached Li Yi and said sweetly, Brother, Cindy wants to eat sugar filling. Li Yi's hands were full of glutinous rice flour. He tapped the tip of her nose and said, You can only eat 2 sugar filling. If you have cavities, it will be very painful. Yongning thought about it and looked up at him. She held out 3 fingers and said, How about 3? Looking at her pitiful look, Li Yi could only nod. 3 it is, no more, okay. Yongning nodded her head forcefully. Worried that Li Yi would go back on his words, she hurriedly ran to Xianing's side and stared with wide eyes. The proud Lolita was holding a small sieve and shaking it. Inside the sieve were yuanxiao and glutinous rice flour. The yuanxiao shaken this way was round and round. She was never tired of this work. After shaking for a while, she slowly walked over and looked at Li Yi. She said, Sir, can you make some bean paste filling? I will bring it to father when I return to the palace in the afternoon. Father loves to eat bean paste filling the most. Li Yi smiled at her and said, Sister Xiaoqing is already preparing the filling. We will make it together later. The proud Lolita immediately became happy. Yongning walked to her side and looked at the small sieve in her hand. She whispered, "Sister, can I play with this?" Yuan Shao was to be eaten in the evening. It was still early. The 15th day of the first lunar month was the busiest day of the year in the capital city. Yongning and Shanning spent most of their time in the palace. They had to go back at night, so they couldn't miss this opportunity. After lunch, Li Yi took the two of them to the street. Compared to the crowds at night, it was much better during the day because the lantern show, fireworks, and other important events would only start at night. On the street, there were vendors selling all kinds of snacks, street acrobatics, and all kinds of mechanical gadgets. The two young ladies could not take it all in. Li Yi looked at the bustling crowd, the row upon row of shops, and the endless stream of hawkers on the street. He deeply felt that in these 2 years, the capital had changed a lot. He bought a sugar figurine for Yongning and Shouning that represented their zodiac signs and casually asked the old sugar figurine seller, "Sir, how's business today?" The old man grinned and said, "Business is good. In the past, it would take a day to sell, but today, it's all sold out in an hour." Li Yi looked at the sugar figurine in their hands and said with a smile, "Sir, your skill is good. The sugar figurine is so lifelike. It's not surprising that business is good. I think life at home must be good." The old man shook his head and said, "This old man has been selling sugar figurines all his life. It's only in the past 2 years that life has gotten better. If it weren't for His Majesty's compassion for people like us and reducing taxes 3 times, I'm afraid I would have frozen to death at home in the winter of the year before last." The shop assistant at the tea stall next to him curled his lips and said, "Old Zhang, you're still acting pitiful here. This year, a sugar figurine seller built new houses for his 2 sons and married new wives. Next year, your sugar figurine shop will be opening soon. Tell me, what's there to cry about?" The old man frowned and said discontentedly, "This old man has this year because of His Majesty's benevolent policy. It's not like I haven't experienced hard times. But Wang Erxiu, you brat, you got a good policy from the beginning." After the proud Lolita finished eating the sugar figurine, she licked her rosy lips and shook Li Yi's arm. She said, "Sir, I want more." Li Yi looked at Yongning on the other side and found that she was also looking at him eagerly. He nodded and looked at the old man selling sugar figurines. He said, "Sir, 2 more please." The old man took out 2 more sugar figurines. When Li Yi paid, he waved his hand and looked at Yongning and Shanning. He said with a smile, "Little girl, you're so handsome. Today is a good day. I'll give these 2 sugar figurines to them." Li Yi handed the sugar figurines to them and said, "Hurry up and thank the old grandpa." "Thank you, old grandpa, thank you, old grandpa," the 2 young girls said obediently. The wrinkles on the old man's face smoothed out like a blooming chrysanthemum. Li Yi held the hands of the 2 young girls and stood on the street. The shouts, peddlers, conversations, and quarrels entered his ears. Together with the images in his eyes, they weaved together to form the embryonic form of a prosperous era. It was a pity that the person who weaved it personally would not be able to see the birth of this prosperous era. "It's a pity that His Majesty's health," sigh, everyone is saying that His Majesty is probably, "Oh my God, why can't he open his eyes and see?" The old man and the shop assistant were still chatting. The proud Lolita bit the sugar figurine in her mouth and lowered her head. She said softly, "Sir, let's go home." Li Yi nodded. He held their hands and walked in the direction they had come from. At the stall, the old man and the shop assistant had finished chatting. He glanced around and saw an extra ingot of silver on the table. He was stunned. When they walked into the courtyard, the proud Lolita suddenly raised her head and looked at him. She said, "Sir, when I return to the palace later, give me a jar of good wine. Father said that your wine is the best." "All right." Li Yi smiled and nodded. Suddenly, He felt a chill at the tip of his nose. He raised his head to look at the sky. Yongning's clear voice rang in his ears. "Brother, it's snowing." Dong! A deep bell rang from a certain direction. Once, twice, the sound came from the east. One after another, it resounded throughout the capital. At the entrance of a certain brothel in the capital. "Who's ringing the bell in broad daylight?" A burly man mumbled in confusion. He saw the middle-aged man beside him suddenly stop in his tracks and turn to walk outside. He asked doubtfully, "Fifth Lord, what's wrong? Aren't you going to watch the show?" The middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. "I'm afraid we won't be able to watch the show today. Let's go back." The noisy streets of the capital gradually quietened down as the bell rang. Someone asked, "How many times did the bell ring?" 45. 45. The bell rang 45 times. It was the sound of a great funeral. A man faced the east and slowly knelt down. Beside him, a second man faced the east and followed suit. 3 people, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, all the officials in the capital, regardless of rank or status, walked out of the guard room and walked to the courtyard. They faced the east and knelt down. At the palace gate, the imperial guards put down their weapons and slowly knelt down. At this moment, only the echoing bell rang in the entire capital. In the Li family, the imperial guard kneeling on the ground stood up and walked to Xiaoning and Yongning. He said in a hoarse voice, "Your Highness, it's time to return to the palace." 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, the Lantern Festival. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, when the first snowflake of this winter landed on Li Yi's nose, it snowed continuously in 13 provinces of the Jing kingdom. 5th year of Jinghe, 15th of the first month, the emperor collapsed. Chapter 972. There was no snow in the winter of the 4th year of Jinghe. At the beginning of the 5th year of Jinghe, it was the Lantern Festival, and the snowflakes in the capital were as heavy as a mat. Li Yi stood in the courtyard, and the bells seemed to be echoing in his ears. The snowflakes fell one after another, and in just a quarter of an hour, there was a snowman in the courtyard. Rui held an umbrella and stood quietly by his side. Drunken Mo and Ruoqing came over and looked at him with worry. "Son-in-law." Tears fell from Xiao Huan's eyes, and she helped Li Yi sweep the snowflakes off his shoulders and head. Mississippi Lu strode over, carried him on her shoulder, and walked briskly back to the room. She reached out to seal his acupoints, roughly took off his coat, and threw him on the bed, covering him with a thick quilt. She turned and closed the door in one go. The emperor had fallen, and the country was in mourning. The officials and nobles in the capital, regardless of their official position, were required to fast for 3 days. Within 27 days, the soldiers and civilians in the capital were required to take off their ornaments and wear plain clothes. Marriage was not allowed within a month, slaughter was not allowed within 49 days, and pleasure was not allowed within 100 days. From the day of mourning in the capital, all temples and monasteries rang 30,000 times. In the 5th year of Jinghe, there was only the 15th of the first month, and no lantern festival. The whole country mourned. The next time Li Yi saw Li Xian alone, it was already 7 days later. His clothes were still gorgeous, but his appearance was very haggard, his lips were chapped, and his beard was unshaven. Of course, Li Yi himself was not much better than him. In these 7 days, except for the ceremony that he needed to attend, he spent most of his time in bed. After sleeping for a long time, he had a headache, and it had not subsided until now. Mingzu was much better than the two of them, but her eyes were dull and she looked a little haggard. The late emperor had passed away, and Li Xian was in charge of the funeral. She still needed to stabilize the affairs of the court. 2 days ago, concubine Cui hanged herself in Yeding. Li Xian sat cross-legged on the ground, and his voice was hoarse. Before she died, she shouted that she did not do anything wrong to your majesty, and that she would go down to accompany you. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "Do you feel that the palace is much more deserted than before?" "This palace has always been deserted." Li Yi shook his head and murmured. Li Xian sighed, "I really don't like this place." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "When will you be enthroned?" The country could not go a day without a ruler. The Jing kingdom was surrounded by enemies. The news of His Majesty's death would soon spread throughout the world. At that time, it was unknown what Qi and Zhao would do. Within a month, a new ruler had to ascend the throne to stabilize the situation. "Let's wait for another month." Li Xian waved his hand, "I want to spend more time with my father. I haven't spent much time with him before." He turned to look at Emingzu and said, "I'll have to trouble Emingzu with the affairs of the court." As Li Yi walked out of the hall, a figure was about to enter. "Teacher," Li Han looked up at him and said in a low voice. Li Yi didn't know if it was an illusion, but he felt that Li Han was thinner than the last time he saw him. Li Yi patted him on the shoulder and raised his head to look around. Under the gray sky, the entire palace was filled with eunuchs and palace maids dressed in silk morning dresses and hurrying about with their heads lowered. It was indeed much more deserted than before. He didn't leave the palace directly, but walked in another direction. This was the imperial harem, and without the emperor's decree, foreign officials were not allowed to enter. But there was an exception. In front of a palace maid bowed respectfully and said, "Marquis Li, please wait a moment. I'll go inform her ladyship." Li Yi nodded and stood in front of the palace gate. Not long after, the palace maid came out and said, "Marquis Li, please come in." Li Yi walked into this slightly smaller palace and bowed slightly to a woman in palace robes sitting on a couch. "Greetings, her ladyship Yan." "Lord Li, no need to be so polite." There was a trace of tiredness between concubine Yan's brows. She held her forehead and pointed in a direction, saying, "They're both in their rooms. It's good for you to go see." Li Yi passed through a side door, and palace maids and eunuchs kept bowing to him. In front of a room, a palace maid said in a low voice, "Their highnesses haven't been sleeping well these past few days. They've just fallen asleep." "It's fine." Li Yi gently pushed open the door and slowly closed it. On a large bed in the room, two figures, one big and one small, were hugging each other. Even in their dreams, their brows were tightly furrowed. Li Yi walked to the side of the bed. His footsteps were very light and silent. The proud Lolita suddenly woke up from her dream. After seeing him, she was startled, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. She was wearing Hello Kitty pajamas and threw herself into Li Yi's arms. Tears flowed out of her eyes as she choked, "Sir, Father Emperor is gone. I'm so scared." Her voice woke Yongning up. Yongning, who was wearing sheep pajamas, crawled out of the bed. Her eyes were slightly panicked, and she grabbed Shaning with one hand and Li Yi with the other, not letting go. Li Yi sat on the side of the bed and held them in his arms. He whispered, "With Sir here, don't be afraid." He looked at the dark room and the tear-stained face in his arms. He helped her wipe away her tears and said, "Hurry up and put on your clothes. Sir will take you out of the palace." "Really?" The proud Lolita raised her head to look at him, and there were still traces of tears on her face. "Really?" Li Yi nodded. The proud Lolita left Li Yi's arms, lowered her head, and whispered, Then, sir, please turn around. I'm going to change." Not long after, Li Yi walked out holding the hands of the two girls. Concubine Yen stood up and slowly said, "Take them out of the palace. This is not a place for them to stay." Li Yi nodded, looked at her, and said, "Thank you, Concubine Yen." Concubine Yen waved her hand and walked into the depths of the palace. Taking Shanning and Yongning out of the palace only required concubine Yan's permission and a word from Li Xian. Concubine Yan did not have any objections. Li Yi asked a eunuch to bring a message to Li Xian, and then he took them out of the palace. When he walked out of the palace, he looked back. Thick, dark clouds gathered above the palaces, and the pressure made it hard for people to breathe. Concubine Yan was right. This deep palace was indeed not a place for them to stay. Birth, old age, sickness, and death. This was a law that no one could escape. Heaven was unfair. Some people were born to be beggars, and some were born to be emperors. Heaven was also fair. No matter beggars or emperors, they could not escape death in the end. Heaven was impartial. The former emperor was loved and remembered by the people for his benevolent policies. During his reign, he carried out several reforms, improved the people's livelihood, supported the poor, adjusted the tax laws, and reorganized military discipline. He personally created a golden age that had never been seen since the founding of the Jing kingdom. Now that the former emperor had passed away, the golden age had ended, and the whole country was grieving. In a month, the new emperor would be enthroned, and that would be the beginning of a golden age. A new golden age. Foreign Affairs, Chapter of Emperor Jing. On the 15th day of the first lunar month in the 5th year of Jinghe, it snowed continuously in 13 states of the capital region, and the emperor passed away in the Hall of Healing. At the entrance of the emergency room of Shijing City Central Hospital, China. A little girl of about 5 or 6 years old had tears in her eyes. She held a woman's hand and sobbed, "Mom, I'm sorry. If it weren't for me, Dad wouldn't have died." The woman squatted down and gently wiped the tears from her eyes. She said, "Xiao Yi, don't cry. It's not your fault." The door of the emergency room suddenly opened, and a few doctors in white coats came out. The beautiful woman immediately stood up and asked with a worried face, "Doctor, how is he?" "He's out of danger for the time being." The doctor walking in front said, then shook his head and said, "The patient's head was hit, and he's still in a coma. If he can wake up within 24 hours, he'll be fine." "If he doesn't wake up," the woman asked in a trembling voice, "what if he doesn't wake up?" "Please be mentally prepared," the doctor said. The doctor said, and the woman fell back to her seat. "Dad, wake up quickly. Xiao Yi doesn't want to eat cotton candy. Xiao Yi wants Dad to wake up." In the ward, a pale man was lying on the bed. The little girl held his hand and whispered. The woman pushed the door open and came in. She squatted down and picked her up. She said, "Xiao Yi, get ready to go to school." "Xiao Yi doesn't want to go to school. Xiao Yi wants Dad to wake up." The little girl shook her head and said stubbornly, "Dad has been sleeping for a month. Why hasn't he woken up yet? Adults can't stay in bed." The woman turned her face away so that the child wouldn't see her tears fall. She took a deep breath and said, "Xiao Yi, Dad will sleep for a long time." "Mom, you're lying." The little girl raised her head and looked at her stubbornly. She said, "I saw Dad's fingers move just now. He's going to wake up soon." "Xiao Yi." The woman's face sank for the first time. Seeing the tears in the little girl's eyes, she could only sigh and pick her up. She said softly, "Xiao Yi, let's go to school, okay?" The little girl choked and said, "Mom, Xiao Yi didn't lie. Dad's fingers really moved." The woman closed her eyes and looked at the man on the sickbed for a long time. Then she turned around and walked out of the ward with the child in her arms. "Where is this place? Who are you?" As she stepped out of the ward, a weak voice suddenly came from behind her. She turned her head in disbelief and looked at the man sitting on the sickbed. The man on the sickbed looked at her with the same disbelief and unconcealable surprise. He blurted out, "Liang Fei. Dad." The little girl broke free from her mother's arms and ran to the sickbed, throwing herself into the man's arms. Xiao Yi, be careful. The woman's face changed and she hurried over. Yongning. The man looked at the little girl in his arms and murmured. His face suddenly showed a painful expression. He grabbed his head and growled in his throat. The woman's face changed greatly and she asked, "What's wrong with you? Where are you feeling uncomfortable?" Doctor, doctor." After a while, the man put his hand down from his head. He looked at the woman and shook his head. He said, I'm fine." "How can you be fine?" The woman's face became more anxious. She said, "Check again." "I'm really fine." The man got off the sickbed and held the little girl in his arms. He took a deep breath and said with a smile, "I haven't felt this good in a long time. So that brat didn't lie to me." He murmured in a low voice and looked at a small box in the ward. There was a figure moving inside. "Is this television? Are you really fine?" The woman looked at him suspiciously. The man looked at her and said with a smile, "I'm really fine." "If you're fine." The woman narrowed her eyes and looked at him. She asked, "Li Hong, tell me, which little vixen is Liang Fei?" Unbelievable, this kind of thing can actually happen. Miracle, it's really a miracle. In the hospital, a group of old men held examination reports in their hands and surrounded a middle-aged man, clicking their tongues in wonder. Facing the director of the central hospital and more than 10 leading doctors in the medical world, the man's expression was calm. He asked with a smile, "Can we go now?" An old man looked at him from head to toe for a while before nodding. "You can go after signing this piece of paper. However, to be on the safe side, come back for a follow-up in a week." The man took the ballpoint pen from him. After looking at it in his hand, he frowned. He glanced around and caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the office. He strode over. When everyone saw this, they all looked over. He picked up a writing brush, dipped it in ink, and wrote down his name. Good writing. At that moment, an old man's eyes suddenly lit up. He looked at him and asked, "May I know which leading master in the calligraphy world is this gentleman's teacher?" Li Yi. After smiling, the man picked up the little girl with one hand and the woman with the other, and strode away. Li Yi. The old man stroked his beard and said doubtfully, "I've never heard of him." Walking out of the hospital, the man looked at the towering buildings and the iron shells shuttling on the streets. His face showed shock. "When did you learn to write with a brush?" The woman turned her head and looked at him in surprise. She asked, "Why didn't I know?" The man smiled and said, "A long time ago." When the woman was about to speak, the mobile phone in her pocket suddenly rang. The man looked at the mobile phone in her hand in a daze and murmured, "Voice from 1,000 miles away." The woman smiled and answered the phone. She said, "Mom." "Yes, he's already awake. We've checked him and there's no problem. We'll be back soon." After hanging up the phone, she found that the man had been looking at her. She blushed slightly and said angrily, "Why are you looking at me?" The man smiled and said, "Because you're good-looking. Don't be serious." The woman glared at him and said, "Are you hungry? Let's go eat first." The man shook his head and said, "I want to go to the library first." The woman looked at him and asked uncertainly, "Now?" The man nodded and said, "Now. Well, the provincial library is only 2 stops away from here." The woman nodded and said, "You've just been discharged from the hospital. It's appropriate for you to exercise. Let's walk." As soon as she finished speaking, a panicked voice suddenly came from the hospital. "Catch the thief! Catch the thief!" A figure ran out of the hospital in a panic. When he passed by the man, he suddenly stopped. It was not because he felt guilty and wanted to repent, but because a hand like an iron clamp grabbed his wrist. You're courting death." He was shocked and angry. He pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed the man's waist. "No!" The woman only had time to let out a scream. The dagger in the thief's hand fell into the man's hand. The man held the little girl in one hand and threw the dagger aside. He looked at the thief and said coldly, "How dare you?" The thief looked at him and felt an oppressive momentum. Suddenly, a burst of fear came from the bottom of his heart. His back was soaked with cold sweat. His legs gave way and he fell to the ground. "Wow! Dad is so powerful." The little girl put her arms around the man's neck. Her eyes were full of little stars. She kissed him hard on the face. The woman next to him also looked at him in disbelief. Her beautiful eyes were full of splendor. The hospital security guards rushed out and restrained the thief. A young woman ran out and bowed to the man. "My ID card and bank card are in the bag." "Thank you so much." The man looked at her miniskirt and revealed a small part of her chest. He frowned and said, "You're naked in broad daylight." "What a scandal." The young woman looked up at him and said, "You." The man shook his head. "As a woman, how can you be so shameless? You're crazy." The young woman glared at him and hurried away in high heels. A moment later, in the sightseeing elevator of the provincial library, the man looked at the gradually shrinking figure below and smiled. "Why did you have to come to the library?" Walking out of the elevator, the woman shook her head and said, "What books do you want to buy? I'll go buy them. You and Xiao-Yi sit here for a while." The man shook his head and said, "Just walk around here. I'll go back in a while." Next to a bookshelf, the man picked up a book and murmured, "Apollo Program, Amsterdam, Moon Landing, Universe, Black Hole, Interstellar Travel, TNT, Atomic Bomb, Hydrogen Bomb." He walked to another place and picked up a newspaper. iPhone 10 production stopped. Zhang Jingkong announced marriage. The woman walked to his side and asked in confusion, "What are you talking about?" "Nothing." The man smiled and closed his eyes. He quickly opened them and said, "Let's go home." "You're not buying books?" "Not anymore." The man nodded. He carried the little girl and held the woman's hand. When they walked to the elevator, he glanced at the rest area and suddenly stopped in his tracks. The woman turned around and looked at him. "What's wrong?" "I met a friend." The man put the little girl down and said, "Xiao-Yi and Mom stay here for a while. Dad will be there soon." He walked to the rest area and walked to the side of a young man. He pointed at the computer on the table and asked with a smile, "Young man, can I borrow your computer for a while?" The young man raised his head and nodded sleepily. He made way for the man. The man sat down and opened the browser. He typed the words Jing Kingdom in the search box and clicked on Search, The Way of Confucianism, The Unfettered Scholar. The man clicked on a few web pages, shook his head, and closed them. "Thank you. What's your name?" He smiled and extended his hand. The young man was stunned. He shook his hand and said, "Li Yi. Nice to meet you." The man smiled at him. The young man nodded and turned around to sit down. The man raised his leg and kicked the young man's butt. The young man lay on the ground in a very indecent position. "How dare you flirt with my daughter? I'll collect some interest first." The man glared at him fiercely and turned around to leave. The young man got up from the ground in shock. He stared blankly at the elegant man in a suit as he left. He cursed in his heart. He just came to the library to take a nap, but he actually met a lunatic at the door of the elevator. The middle-aged man picked up the little girl and held the woman's hand. He smiled and said, "Let's go home." The little girl looked at him and asked worriedly, "Dad won't sleep again, right?" The man touched her head and said with a smile, "He won't." The woman beside him glanced at him and said, "I'll let you go for now. Tell me honestly who Liang Fei is when we go back." Chapter 973. It was already the 3rd month of the 5th year of Jinghe. In the 3rd month of spring, the grass was long and the orioles were flying. It was the season of recovery. The green willows in the hibiscus garden had already sprouted new buds, and the apricot forest was filled with a delicate fragrance. The blue water rippled in the breeze, and a girl's voice was crisp and sweet. "Sir, come and see, I caught a big fish." Li Yi walked over and helped Shanning take the fish off the hook. At the age of 14, the girl's face had lost most of its immaturity. When she raised her head and smiled, it seemed that the spring scenery in the garden was a lot brighter. A guard took the fat fish, skillfully cut open its belly, removed the scales, and handed it to Prince Jean, Li Han, who was next to the grill. Li Han, who was close to 13 years old and could roast fish well, was already the official dean of the academy. His originally chubby face had started to become more angular. At this time, it had been more than half a month since Li Xian ascended the throne at the beginning of March. The former emperor, Renzong, died at the beginning of the year. Jinghe's reign ended in the 5th year, but to establish a new era, it would have to wait until next year. Just like the late spring, in the 3rd month of spring, the capital and even the entire Jing kingdom began to exude vitality. The court was running steadily, the people lived and worked in peace and contentment, the public security was good, and the economy was booming. Of course, these had nothing to do with the unreliable emperor. Li Xian was using a microscope to observe the microorganisms in the lake. Things made with glass were no longer much of a challenge for the Academy of Sciences. They had already made presbyopic glasses, which could be said to be a blessing for some old ministers in the court. It was said that after an old imperial censor's presbyopia was cured, he didn't say a word about Li Xian wanting to increase research funds for the Academy of Sciences. Li Xian, the bastard emperor, was so lazy that when he presided over the funeral of the late emperor, he entrusted all the affairs of the court to his assistant, Mingsu. After he ascended to the throne, he seemed to have completely forgotten about this matter. At first, he did not forget to attend the court every day, but he only persisted for 10 days before handing over all the affairs of the court to Mingsu with the excuse that he was busy with his research. The officials had nothing to say. After going through so many things, they understood that the Jing kingdom could not live without a princess, nor could it live without His Majesty. Such an arrangement seemed absurd, but it was the most suitable one. Li Yi held Yongning's hand and walked towards the lawn with Shanning by his side. 2 small figures walked and crawled on the lawn. Occasionally, they would lose their balance and fall. Rui and Crown Princess. Now they should be called the Empress. Rui and the Empress had told the maids and guards around them to let them play by themselves. After falling and beating, the bodies of the children, who were almost 1.5 years old, would become stronger. From the 4th year to the 5th year of Jinghe, among the officials and nobles in the capital, the Wang family was undoubtedly the biggest winner. In the beginning, many people thought that the Wang family was destroying the foundation of the family by marrying the crown prince instead of the king of Shu, who was favored by the officials. Now, those people had to rely on the Wang family to survive. They had the most powerful financial resources in the Jing kingdom and were backed by the most powerful forces in the Jing kingdom. Who could compete with the Wang family? If there was only one family. In terms of financial resources, ordinary people would naturally think of the god of wealth's family in the Jing kingdom. However, a small number of people knew that the Li family's financial resources were not far from the Wang family's, or even surpassed it, in terms of power. Although the Wang family had the empress, they still couldn't compare with the favored officials of the 2 dynasties. The Wang family didn't need to compare either, because the Wang family and the Li family had a special relationship. Yongning and Shanning ran to play with Li Duan and Li Rui. Li Yi walked to Rui and Wang Qin and bowed slightly. "Greetings, Your Highness." Wang Qin smiled and said, "Sister Rui and I are like sisters." "County Marquis Li, you don't have to be so polite." Although Li Xian was the emperor, there was only one empress in the harem. Many officials in the court had repeatedly written to him, asking him to appoint concubines, but to no avail. This was also the reason why the Wang family's position in the court was becoming more and more stable. If the emperor didn't appoint a new concubine, there was no suspense about who would be the next emperor. Li Han came over with a plate and said, "Sir, the fish is grilled. I didn't put too much seasoning on it." Li Han's grilling technique had been unanimously approved by everyone, so Prince Jean was also a part-time grill hand in addition to being the dean of the academy. Rui liked to eat lightly flavored food, so Li Yi asked him to put less seasoning. The empress' taste should be similar. She didn't have many friends in the palace, so she often called Rui to the palace. Li Xian later directly moved his family to Furong Garden. Anyway, there were only 2 people in his family. This place wasn't far from the Li family, so he and Rui often visited each other. Ladies first. There were many fish bones in the lake. Li Yi used chopsticks to pick out the bones, then handed the plate to Rui and walked towards Li Xian by the lake. Wang Qin sighed softly and said, "When father was alive, his favorite people were my husband, Emingzu, and County Marquis Li. Father's death was a great blow to them." Rui smiled and said, "My husband often said that death is not the end. Maybe the former emperor just went to another world." The former emperor was the emperor, a dragon among men. Even in another world, he could live very well. "I believe that His Majesty and Her Royal Highness also think so. You have an undeserved reputation as the Dean of the Academy of Mathematics. All the matters of the Academy are done by Xiao Han. It's just a title, and there's no need to trouble you. Why do you want to resign?" Li Xian withdrew his gaze from the microscope and looked at him. Opportunities should always be left to young people. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Xiao Han has been coveting that position for a long time. As a teacher, I naturally have to fulfill his wish." Li Xian did not continue this topic. He thought of something and suddenly said, "I almost forgot that you are only a county marquis now. How about I make you a county magistrate?" "Forget it. How about a duke?" Since the founding of the country, no duke had been conferred, not even a county magistrate. His title of county marquis had been an exception for decades. Li Yi looked at Li Xian and asked, "Why don't you make me a prince?" "You want to be a prince?" Li Xian thought for a while and said, "If you want to be a prince, I'll write an edict when I go back." If Li Xian really issued this edict, there might be a courtier who would kill himself tomorrow. For the sake of his own reputation, Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Forget it. A county marquis is good. His Majesty is gone, and there's no point in being a duke or a prince." He looked at Li Xian and said, "You can't throw all the matters of court politics to Mingzhu. You are the emperor, and you are also a man. Can't you act like a man and shoulder the responsibilities you should bear?" Li Xian looked at him and asked, "What's wrong? Do you feel sorry for her?" "If you feel sorry for her, you can help her yourself." Li Xian glanced at him and said, "You and Emingzi can solve any problem if you work together." Li Yi took a deep breath and asked, "Are you the emperor or am I the emperor?" Li Xian asked back, "Do you like Emingzu or do I like Emingzu?" Li Yi was defeated again. "However, you are right about one thing." Li Xian thought for a while and suddenly said, "Since you are a man, you should bear the responsibility that a man should have." Li Yi nodded. This guy was somewhat responsible. Li Xian looked in a certain direction and murmured, "Little Han is already 13 years old. In another 2 years, he will be a man, right?" Somewhere by the lake, Li Han, who was roasting fish, suddenly had goosebumps and his body couldn't help but tremble. Chapter 974. In a feudal society where imperial power was supreme, the throne was the most dignified and supreme thing. Li Xian's way of thinking, which was like kicking the throne around like a ball, was very different from the ancient people. Li Yi felt deeply guilty. Thinking about how Li Yi was obsessed with mental arithmetic and was exactly the same as him, as his teacher, Li Yi felt that his sins were even deeper. Li Xian was still young, and his thoughts were too idealistic and unrealistic. In 2 years, he would understand that the throne wasn't something he could give up just because he wanted to, and he could give it to whoever he wanted. Li Han could be a good head of the arithmetic academy, and he could be a cook, but it was unlikely that he could be a good emperor. At least, this was what Li Yi thought when he ate the fish he roasted. After handing over the fish with the bones removed to Yongning and Shaoning, Li Han walked over and looked at Li Xian in the distance. He asked hesitantly, "Teacher, what were you talking about with my brother?" Li Yi picked up a piece of fish and asked, "What's wrong?" Li Han shook his head and said, "Nothing. It's just that I have a bad feeling." Children nowadays had a strong desire to live. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head, saying, "We didn't talk about much. Don't think too much, go roast another fish." Furong Garden had a quiet environment and pleasant scenery. Other than Xujiang Gardens, it was one of the 2 most beautiful imperial gardens in the capital. The Li family wasn't far from these 2 places. When he and Rui went home, they didn't even need to take a carriage. Li Yi carried the already asleep Li Duan. Rui tilted her head and looked at him, asking, "Husband, do you feel that Duaner really likes Xiao Rui?" Such a young child actually didn't know whether he liked or not. It was just that the 2 children had played together for a long time and were used to it. If it was a kitten or a puppy, he would still like it. Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Did Her Majesty and Nyangzi say something?" Rui smiled and nodded. She said that Duaner and Xiao Rui were born on the same day. It's fate from their previous lives. If they can grow up together like this, they can be considered childhood sweethearts. Why don't we settle the marriage now? Because of his own experience, Li Yi abhorred things like arranged marriages or child betrothal. He shook his head and said, "Their affairs will depend on themselves in the future. We'd better not interfere too much." Rui obviously liked Xiao Rui very much. She thought for a moment and said, "But Xiao Rui is a princess. When the time comes, many people will want to marry into the royal family. If the Duaner likes her and she is betrothed to someone else, then let's snatch." Li Yi said without hesitation, "My wife is the best at snatching people." Rui took Li Duan from his arms and said lightly, "I have something to discuss with Sister Zuemo. Husband, sleep in the study tonight." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Don't. If there's anything to discuss, let's go together." Rui looked at him and asked, "Sister Zuemo and I are going to discuss all night. Does husband want to join us? If you don't mind." Li Yi looked at the smile on Rui's face, waved his hand, and said, "Forget it. That bed is too small for 3 people." He had originally planned to marry Zuemo at the beginning of the year, but because of the death of the former emperor, he could only postpone the date. Now, although a month had passed, there was no auspicious date in a short period of time. Of course, the more important reason was that he thought that the time between the 2 events was too short, and he felt uneasy. He was gratified that Zuemo could understand this and even comforted him. How lucky he was in this life to be able to meet these women. Thinking about it, this might also be God's compensation for his previous life. After all, he went to the library with the intention of learning. Not only did he meet a psychopath who returned kindness with ingratitude, but he also encountered an incredible fire. God owed him too much. At the gate of the Li mansion, Li Yi unexpectedly saw a person. The gatekeeper of the Li family said politely to a young man, "Sir, my master and madam have gone out. I don't know when they will be back. Why don't you come again tomorrow, or wait in the mansion?" The young man cupped his hands and said, "In that case, I will come again another day." "No need for another day. Li Yi walked over, patted Jiang Ziyan on the shoulder, and said with a smile, "Brother Jiang, what's the matter? Let's talk inside." The expression on Jiang Ziyan's face immediately became respectful, lordly. In the mansion, the maids served good tea. Li Yi looked at Jiang Ziyan and asked with a smile, "Brother Ziyan should be leaving soon, right?" "Yes, the appointment from the Ministry of Personnel has been issued. I will leave tomorrow." Jiang Ziyan nodded and suddenly stood up. He bowed deeply to Li Yi and said, "Jiang Ziyan thanks Lord Li for saving my life." His former friend had almost pushed him into the abyss. His former enemy had not only saved him from prison, but had also given him a bright career. At this moment, standing in front of Li Yi, his heart was in turmoil, and he could not control himself. Li Yi stood up and helped him up. He said, "Brother Jiang, please be careful on this trip to Qinghai Prefecture. Anxi County is also your hometown. You must govern it well in the future. Don't let your people down." Jiang Ziyan's expression was solemn. He bowed and said, "Ziyan will not let Lord Li down." Li Yi smiled and said, "You don't have to be so polite. Sit." After Jiang Ziyan sat down, he cupped his hands again and said, "I have offended you in the past. Lord Li, please forgive me." I don't mention the past." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "How can there be no wine when old friends gather? Servants, bring wine." The Li family's cooks were very fast. In a quarter of an hour, a jar of wine and a few dishes were served. Li Yi had once made up his mind to never drink again, but he did not persist for long. During this time, he had failed to compete with Mississippi Liu and Emingzu in terms of drinking, but his tolerance for alcohol had greatly improved. Jiang Ziyan was very restrained at first, but after a few cups of wine, he gradually became intoxicated. "Lord Li, Brother Li, do you really think of me as a friend?" "Of course. I, Li Yi, don't have many friends. You, Jiang Ziyan, are one of them. Don't forget, we are friends who have been through life and death together. Since we are friends, there are some things that I have to say." Jiang Ziyan's eyes were hazy from the alcohol. He looked at him discontentedly and said, "Miss Ruoqing is such a good woman. Even if she is the Empress, don't you want to find her? You scolded those Jinshi in Prince Ning Mansion, where is your courage?" Li Yi slapped him on the head and scolded, "At this time, you still dare to think about my Ruoqing?" "I don't think about her." Jiang Ziyan's face turned red. He stared at him and said, "I just feel that what you did was not like a man. I am not like a man." Li Yi looked at Jiang Ziyan and took the woman who was pouring wine for him into his arms. He said, "Ruoqing, tell him, do I look like a man?" Jiang Ziyan was shocked. "Ah, you are Miss Ruoqing." At the door, hearing the man's hearty laughter coming from the room, drunken Mo lowered her head, and a trace of sadness appeared in her eyes. Although he was laughing, it did not mean that he was really happy. If he was really happy, he would not have to drink. If he was not happy, it would be difficult for her to smile. Rui walked to her side, glanced into the room, and whispered, "After the former emperor left, my husband did not have many enemies, nor did he have many friends. He once said that after the former emperor left, no one could shelter them from the wind and rain." Drunken Mo looked at the figure in the room and shook her head. Now in the capital, who can set off a storm? They respect him, fear him, and fear him. He actually does not like this. Rui took her hand and shook her head. "There is only one side of my husband that we do not understand." Jiang Ziyan was soon drunk and was helped to the guest room by the servants of the Li family to rest. Li Yi leaned against the chair and rested for a moment. When he opened his eyes, he saw an old face full of wrinkles. Since the death of the emperor, he had not seen this old face for a long time. Chapter 975. After the death of the previous emperor, Changde had gone to the mausoleum to guard it. There was still a long way to go before the 1-year deadline. Seeing him here, other than pleasant surprise, Li Yi was also surprised. "Chang, why have you come out?" he asked in surprise. He then waved his hand and poured a cup of wine for him. "Don't say anything else. It's not easy to see each other, let's drink." Changde's old face remained expressionless. He didn't touch the wine cup. Lightly, he said, "The emperor can't see the world anymore, so I came out to see for the emperor." "I say, can you not always put on that dead face?" Li Yi handed the wine cup to his hand and said with some dissatisfaction, "If you have nothing to do, smile more. Smiling can extend your life by 5 seconds. You're already so old, shouldn't you be more careful?" Changde opened his mouth and asked, "Should I smile like this?" Li Yi looked at his smile and paused. He then shook his head and said, "Never mind, it's best if you don't smile." Changde picked up the wine jar and took a big gulp before saying, "It's all thanks to you that the emperor was able to last these years. If it weren't for you, the emperor would not have been able to let go of the world before he died." Li Yi waved his hand. "There's no need to say such things." Changde put down the wine jar and looked at him. "What plans do you have for the future?" "What plans?" Li Yi thought for a bit and then shook his head. "I don't know." "What about you? In a year, will you still return to the court?" Very few people knew that Changde was not only the head of the internal surveillance but also the true leader of the Secret Intelligence Bureau. He had single-handedly established the Secret Intelligence Bureau. He was a knife in the hands of the previous 2 emperors, a sharp blade hanging over the heads of the officials and nobles in Jingdo. "Didn't you say that opportunities are for the young?" Changde looked at him and shook his head. "Even you are not a young man, so why should this old man occupy this position and not leave? The previous emperor entrusted His Majesty to me, and now that His Majesty has left, this old man's mission is complete." Li Yi lowered his head and drank without saying a word. The departure of the former emperor not only represented the replacement of the old and the new dynasties, but it was also a turning point for him, for Changde, for Li Xian, for Emingzu, and for some others. Once one's position changed, one's former friends and enemies would no longer be the same. Changde raised his head and took another gulp. "Suddenly," he said, "before His Majesty left, he asked me to pass a few words to you." "What did His Majesty say?" Li Yi looked up at him. Changde narrowed his eyes and said, "His Majesty wants me to tell you that if you betray Emingzu, he won't let you off even if he's in the underworld or in another world." Li Yi's expression didn't change as he asked, "What else?" "When you leave, take Yongning with you. She can't live without you." Li Yi nodded. These were 2 souls that were connected to each other. Not only could Yongning not live without him, he could not live without Yongning either. He looked at Changde and continued to ask, "Anything else? Don't hurt Shaoning. She's still a child who doesn't understand anything." Changde put down his wine cup and said, "When she truly understands these things, let her make her own decision." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Understand what?" Changde shook his head and said, "I'm just passing on His Majesty's words to you." Li Yi thought about it and nodded. "Okay." After the death of the former emperor, Chief Eunuch Changde guarded the imperial mausoleum for a year. During this year, he didn't leave the mausoleum at all. As someone who had followed the former emperor his entire life, no one understood the former emperor better than him, and no one knew what he wanted to do better than him. When he saw Changde out of the Li residence, he ran into the slovenly old man. After getting to know the slovenly old man, Li Yi understood that reaching the peak in any field was not by chance, but by necessity. Before getting to know the slovenly old man, the most diligent person he had seen was Yang Liuqing, followed by Mississippi Liu. After getting to know the slovenly old man, Li Yi finally understood how he had reached the Grandmaster realm. He was already so old, but he was still working so hard. If he didn't become a grandmaster, there would be no justice in this world. However, being a master was lonely. As a grandmaster, only grandmasters could be his opponent. Rui was a grandmaster, but she wouldn't spar with the slovenly old man. Taoist Nun was also a grandmaster, but she was thousands of miles away. There were also grandmasters nearby. Li Yi still didn't know what realm's second great-uncle was at, but he was definitely strong enough to be a match for the slovenly old man. Unfortunately, he wasn't so lonely in front of second great-uncle. Of course, the closest grandmaster was Old Man Chang in front of him. The two were about the same age, and their realms were similar. They were indeed excellent opponents. The slovenly old man walked past them, paused, and quickly walked back, looking at Changde. At this moment, Li Yi actually saw some kind of inexplicable light in his eyes. Fight? The slovenly old man looked at Changde and suddenly said. Old Man Chang maintained his usual aloof manner, glanced at him indifferently, and walked out of the door. The slovenly old man smiled disdainfully. You don't dare. This kind of clumsy provocation naturally had no effect on Old Man Chang, who was familiar with all kinds of tricks in the palace. Changde's footsteps were very steady, and he was about to step out of the door. The slovenly old man said angrily, You sly old man, has the courage of a grandmaster been eaten by a dog? Changde paused, but the next moment, he still walked out of the door without hesitation. The slovenly old man thought for a moment and said calmly, You don't have a dick. Li Yi suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. Then, he heard a familiar, cold voice. Since you want to die, I'll fulfill your wish. He ran inside, shouting as he ran, Rui, Rui, come out and watch the show. Mississippi Lu was in the room, writing at the desk. She was probably dealing with Lu Meng's matter. The current her was becoming more and more like a qualified chief of Wulin. What's the matter? She looked up at Li Yi, who had suddenly barged in, and asked. There's no time to explain. Let's go out first. Li Yi grabbed her arm and ran outside. A battle between grandmasters was not something that could be seen every day, especially when grandmasters fought with their lives on the line. Mississippi Lu was only one step away from this realm. After watching it, she might have some feelings. There was no need for Li Yi to explain it all. Mississippi Lu was pulled out of the door by him. When she saw the two vague figures outside, she had already stopped and could not look away. Li Yi only saw two shadows, and could not help but ask curiously, How is it? Who has the upper hand now? Don't talk. Mississippi Lu reached out to cover his mouth. Li Yi moved her hand away and smelled a familiar fragrance. He spat a few times, and then looked at the field again. Old Man Chang might really be fighting with his life this time. He fought from the ground to the top of the wall, from the top of the wall to the sky, and finally from the sky to the ground. Li Yi could not see their moves clearly. After about a quarter of an hour, there was a loud bang. The two figures separated and stood on one side of the wall. It felt like the battle between Shimin Chueshue and Yi Guqing. Awesome. I haven't fought so happily for a long time. The sloppy old man laughed and said, I can't beat you, and you can't beat me. Let's call it a draw today. Let's fight another day. What do you think? Changde's fists, which were hidden in his sleeves, trembled slightly. He looked at him coldly and jumped off the wall. Without saying anything, he turned around and left. Seeing him leave, an unnatural flush appeared on the sloppy old man's face. He jumped down from the top of the wall and muttered, This old thing is worthy of being from the palace. If it wasn't for the fact that he has made some progress these days, he would have lost face today. Mississippi Lu stood where she was, deep in thought. Li Yi looked at her, walked to the sloppy old man, and asked, Su, how difficult is it to break through the bottleneck of supreme power? Do you have any experience? It's difficult, but it's not difficult either. The sloppy old man looked back at Mississippi. Luan said, some people find it difficult in their bodies, while others find it difficult in their hearts. Let go of your obsession and worries, and only then can you pass the barrier of your heart. After saying that, he strode inside. Li Yi followed closely and asked curiously, what do you mean? Those who should understand will understand as soon as they hear it, and it's useless for those who shouldn't understand to say it. The sloppy old man smiled and said, whether or not your clan's second miss and that little princess can take that step in this lifetime will depend on whether or not they can overcome the barrier of their hearts. What stubbornness, worry, or lack thereof? Instead of advising others to practice diligently, what idealism was this? Li Yi looked at the sloppy old man and suddenly asked, so, Elder Su has also once let go of his stubbornness and worries. The sloppy old man stopped, and a complicated expression appeared on his face, but he did not answer. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, I have one last question. Yes. The sloppy old man's figure disappeared, leaving only a long sigh. Chapter 976. Who do you love? Li Yi looked at the empty courtyard and asked in confusion. He just wanted to ask the sloppy old man what his chances of becoming a grandmaster were. After all, if Rui and Emingsu were blocked at the door of grandmaster status and couldn't take that step, he still had a chance to catch up and restore his manhood. Who did he say he loved? Changde. He had heard of friendship forged by fighting, but he had never heard of gay love forged by fighting. Could it be that the two of them had fallen in love with each other and developed into a gay relationship? Hearing a voice coming from behind, Li Yi looked back and saw the old woman standing at the door looking at him. Come in with me for a moment. The old woman turned and walked into the room. Li Yi didn't hesitate and followed. The old woman had always been very concerned about the Li family. This time, she had set the date and written all the invitations. All she had to do was wait to send them out, but it was a national funeral. She felt a bit regretful. After the 1-month deadline, she mentioned it to him twice in a vague way, but he deliberately avoided it. It seemed that he couldn't wait any longer. The old woman put away the wine jars in the room and said, the previous emperor treated you and the Li family well when he was alive. You should be grieving when the previous emperor passed away. But the dead are gone, and the living must live on well. You still have Rui, Zumo, and Dwainer. You shouldn't be overly sad. Li Yi smiled and nodded. I know. In the beginning, his mood was indeed gloomy for a long time. That was because ever since they first met in Qing and Fu, there had been no relationship between the ruler and his official. They were ruler and official, and they were also friends. Even though he had always been mentally prepared, when the day really came, it was still difficult to accept. But just as the old woman said, the dead were gone, and the living must live well. Being overly immersed in the sorrow of the past was irresponsible for the future and the performance of a coward. His Majesty didn't come today. The old mistress nodded slightly and suddenly asked. As an emperor, Li Xian did not attend to his duties. Every day, he would visit the Li family. Occasionally, it would be Li Yi and Rui. Li Yi explained to the old mistress, he didn't come today. Rui and I just came back from Lotus Garden. Madame Dowager looked at him and asked, you and His Majesty have known each other for 4 years, right? Li Yi thought about it and said, less than 4 years. He and Li Xian first met in July of the first year of Jinghe. Now it was March of the 5th year of Jinghe. There were still 4 months until the 4th year. 4 years is not a short time. The old mistress sighed and said, it is the Li family's fortune to be favored by 2 emperors. But you must remember that His Majesty is His Majesty. He is no longer the crown Prince Li Xian of the past. It was said that being in the emperor's company was like living with a tiger. Since ancient times, there had been countless cases of good bows being hidden after the birds had been killed. It seemed that emperors were supposed to be cold and heartless. Most people, including the old mistress, thought so too. But none of the emperors that Li Yi knew were like this. The previous emperor was benevolent, not only toward the court but also toward people. After Li Xian became emperor, his temperament did not change at all. He was not a qualified emperor. He was straightforward and free. The things that the old mistress worried about would not happen, at least for the time being. But even though he believed in Li Xian, others did not. Since ancient times, heaven, earth, emperor, and teacher have to respect etiquette and ethics. The old mistress looked at him and sighed again. She said, I know that you and His Majesty are close friends, but people's hearts change. For the sake of the Li family, you must be more careful and not fall too deeply into it. Li Yi thought for a long time and then lowered his head. He said, Grandson will remember. I still envy you. You only have the title of Golden Ziguang Doctor. Li Xian put his hands behind his head as he lay on the rocking chair. Looking at the sky, he murmured, beautiful wives and concubines, no worldly affairs, free and unfettered. What more can a husband ask for in life? You want to take concubines? Li Yi sat by the stone table and looked at him. He said, if you want to do it, then do it. Your harem is so empty, it should be enriched. Li Xian looked back. The two women should be in the room. Only then did he relax. He said, we are not the same. I only need Qin her. Li Yi suddenly asked, how is your brother Xin? Brother Xin. Li Xian thought for a moment and said, he has already graduated from the Mathematics Institute. I feel that he is more suitable for our Academy of Sciences. I don't know where the Ministry of Appointments will send him, so I am preparing to headhunt him. Then he felt that something was wrong. He looked at Li Yi and said, don't try to change the topic. I, the Emperor, am not as free as you, the Marquis. This is too unreasonable. Li Xian was clearly brooding over this matter. He hesitated for a moment and said, Prime Minister Qin has already resigned 3 times and I persuaded him to come back. The Qin family has suffered such a great change. Prime Minister Qin is disheartened and his health is not as good as before. If he has made up his mind, I will allow him to retire. After Prime Minister Qin's resignation, the position of the right minister will be vacant. Only you can take this position. At that time, you and Emmingzu will be in cahoots. Li Yi pointed at Li Xian, looked behind him and said, he is cursing you. Emmingzu had just finished sparring with Rui. Her hair was wet. Li Xian jumped up from the chair and said, I am going to see Xiao Rui. Mingzhu was a noble princess, and always had a heroic spirit that did not lose to any man. This heroic spirit was something that even the Lu's second young miss did not have. In other words, even Mississippi Lu was more feminine than Emmingzu. Of course, these words could not be said in front of him. Otherwise, he might be greeted with a beating from both women. However, when she took a bath and put up her wet hair in front of him, Li Yi felt that his understanding of her was not complete. At this time, Her Royal Highness still had a little bit of femininity. After putting up her hair, she looked at Li Yi and said in surprise, Why are you looking at me? Is there something on my face? Li Yi shook his head repeatedly, no. She did not continue this topic and asked, Did Chief Chang come to see you 2 days ago? Li Yi was puzzled, he did not return to the palace. Emmingsi shook her head and said, He only came here to take a look around the capital and then returned to the mausoleum. Li Yi explained, His Majesty had a few words for him to bring to me. Father. Although her and Li Xian's identity had been announced, she was still used to calling the former emperor this way. Li Yi nodded. Mingsu looked at her, thought for a moment and asked, "What did father say?" She shouldn't have asked this question, but she wanted to know anything about her father. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "His Majesty asked me to take care of you and Li Xian." Mingsu looked at him and said, "Father already said this the other night." Li Yi was speechless for a moment. He could not tell her that her father told him not to let her down in the future and that when she did not want to be the empress, they could make do with each other. His Majesty also said that Shanning is only a child now. When she grows up, she can make her own decisions. Mingsu looked at him and asked in confusion, "What does that mean?" "Yes, sir, what does that mean?" The girl ran out of the room, thought for a moment and said with some dissatisfaction, "I am already 14 years old, I am not a child anymore." Li Yi patted her head and said, "When will you stop saying that you're not a child anymore?" "You're not a child anymore," the dizzy girl nodded and said, "When that time comes, will I be able to make my own decisions?" Li Yi nodded. "This is your father's verbal order, it is the same as an imperial edict. I knew father treats me the best." The girl smiled excitedly and her eyes flashed. She murmured, "Can I make my own decisions? I will ask Brother Xian to write an imperial edict when I go back." Chapter 977. What are you thinking about? Li Yi flicked his finger on her forehead and said, "This imperial edict will only count when you grow up." Among the girls, Duanwu was the most obedient, Yongning was the most adorable, and Shanning was the most mischievous one. She had countless ideas and no one knew what she was thinking in her little head. "That's what I said." Shanning covered her forehead and ran away with a chuckle. Soon, she ran back and asked, "Then how old is considered to be grown up?" Li Yi rubbed her hair and said, "You will know when you grow up." After Shanning ran away, Li Yi thought of what just happened and turned to Mingzu and said, "Li Xian doesn't think before doing things. You should suppress him." "You mean the position of the right minister?" Mingzu thought about it and said, "But I think this position is quite suitable for you. Don't you want to be in cahoots with me?" "Cahoots?" Li Yi shook his head and asked, "Who's the wolf and who's the bay?" Mingzu thought about it and said, "I think it's the bay. I like to be in the top." Since the death of the former emperor at the beginning of the year, the court was generally peaceful. It wasn't until April that there was another disturbance. Prime Minister Qin resigned many times. After the emperor agreed, he was conferred the title of Special Minister. This was also a non-official who didn't directly participate in the court affairs. His position was even higher than the Minister of Honor. He had the right to attend the court meetings and greet the Prime Minister. The left and right ministers were the two towering pillars of the court. Now that one of them had fallen, it was natural to build another one. In recent years, the court of the Jing Kingdom was becoming younger. There weren't many senior officials like Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shen left. Because of their old age, they weren't suitable for the position. A country could live without a ruler, but it couldn't live without a prime minister. In the court meeting at the beginning of April, the ownership of the right minister's position was naturally the most important. The imperial court tended to be younger, but it was not to the extent that there was a gap between the old and the young. The Wang family, the Shen family, and a limited number of officials with experience and ability could all be choices. There was no need to consider the Shen family. In the imperial court, it was impossible for the left and right ministers to come from the Shen family. The Shen family would not participate and the officials would not agree. The other officials were at a disadvantage in the struggle for the position of prime minister, either because they did not have enough experience or because they did not have enough background. On the surface, the Wang family had the greatest hope. Because of the empress, the officials were almost certain that the Wang family would rise to a higher level this time. However, His Majesty stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and wanted to bestow the position of Right Minister to County Marquis Li. This made all the officials' jaws drop. Although His Majesty favored County Marquis Li, he had to be fair to all the officials in the imperial court. It was a bit too much to be swayed by emotions and want to pile all the good things on County Marquis Li. What's more, the position of Prime Minister was not a cabbage. It was the cornerstone of the imperial court. It needed both ability and experience. No one doubted County Marquis Li's ability, but his experience, forget it, let's not talk about experience. In the past 2 years, a certain atmosphere had been formed in the imperial court. They only talked about ability, not experience. If you can do it, you can do it. If you can't, you can replace someone else. Don't mention who your father is or who your grandfather is. Of course, if the two people's ability was similar, it would depend on the father or the grandfather. As for County Marquis Li, no one doubted his ability. Because he was too capable and too young, they didn't care about the lack of experience. They didn't even care about whether there was such a precedent, but the problem was, he was lazy. Although he held a high position, many of the officials could only see him once a year at the imperial court. He was the dean of the School of Mathematics, but he only treated the School of Mathematics as a fishing ground. He was capable, but he was lazy. If County Marquis Li really became the Prime Minister, what was the difference between the imperial court and having only one Prime Minister? At that time, Prime Minister Shen would have to deal with all the affairs in the imperial court alone, and it would not be long before he resigned and retired. Li Xian's idea naturally attracted the opposition of the officials. Of course, for them, County Marquis Li had no other shortcomings except laziness. Their opposition was still very vague. Even so, the atmosphere between the emperor and the officials was still a bit unpleasant. Li found that he knew Li Xian better than himself. Could this guy's brain really not work a little bit? You can leave the position of the right prime minister to the Wang family or Dong Wenyun. Li looked at him solemnly and said, "Don't give me any more trouble. If you dare to make me prime minister, I will immediately leave the capital. I know you don't care, but I just don't like how they act." Li Xian snorted coldly and said, "Since I, the emperor, can't decide anything, why do they want me to be the emperor?" Li looked at him and asked back, "Do you think you can do whatever you want as the emperor?" Li Xian waved his hand and said, "The more they want it, the more I don't want to give it to them." "The more you don't want it, I still have to give it to you." Li thought for a moment and said, "Since it has come to this, in fact, what I said just now was all a lie. As a scholar, who doesn't want to become a general and become a prime minister? I refused because I know that the more I don't want it, the more you want to give it to me. This is the simplest way to advance by retreating. Do you understand?" Li Xian looked at him and frowned. "So, you also want to be the prime minister?" Li nodded solemnly and said, "Now that it has come to this, I won't hide it from you. I really want to be the prime minister." "If you want to be the prime minister, you should have said so earlier." Li Xian slapped his thigh and said, "If you had said so earlier, would have agreed when Prime Minister Qin resigned for the first time. I was afraid that you wouldn't be happy. Now, I will issue the decree in the morning court tomorrow. One must abide by the rules. Those who don't play by the rules should be struck by lightning. Young master, old Lu is here." Just when Li Yi was wondering why he became so despicable after becoming the emperor, Fang came in with County Magistrate Lu. Lu Dao could be said to be the epitome of the saying, "One never comes to a temple without a cause." Every time he came, there must be something big. And it was something bad. Therefore, Fang privately called him a jinx. "Lu Dao greets your majesty." Lu Dao first bowed to Li Xian respectfully before turning around and bowing. "Lord Li," Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Lord Lu, could it be that something big has happened this time?" Lu Dao shook his head and said, "It's nothing big." It's just that two young men were jealous of a girl in a brothel and tore down a brothel. Both of them were slightly injured and are now being detained by the county government. There was no need for Luda to make a trip here just to tell him about the fight between the two playboys. Li thought for a moment and asked, I'm guessing that one of the young men should be surnamed Li, right? Lu Dao nodded and said, one of them is Li Yingjie, the eldest son of Assistant Minister Li of the Ministry of Personnel. What about the other one? The other one is surnamed Wang. Li Yingjie was the son of his second uncle, Li Mingze, who was about the same age as him. Li Yi had seen him many times but had never talked to him much. Madame Dowager often mentioned him, saying that he had changed his previous playboy character, which was very rare. Not to mention that his father was an assistant minister of the Ministry of Personnel who was on the rise in his career. There were not many people in the capital who would take the initiative to provoke him just because of his surname. Lu Dao's arrival had explained everything. Li Yi stood up and said, let's go and have a look. Chapter 978. There were many powerful officials at the feet of the emperor in the capital, and there were countless hedonistic sons. Their families all had a lot of background, and they were young and vigorous. Almost every month, as the capital magistrate, Lu Dao would handle a few such cases. These cases were not difficult, but they were also difficult. Those influential families were very prideful. Often, the two families involved would settle it in private without going through the county government. If there was no private settlement, he could judge the case impartially. The current county government was no longer what it used to be. As long as they upheld the word reason, there was no need to fear any so-called rich families. However, the situation this time was different. The Wang family could be said to be the most powerful family in the capital. Although the Li family of the Ministry of Personnel was not as powerful as the Wang family, it was supported by a bigger tree. Moreover, the Wang family and the Li family had a good relationship. As an outsider, it was better for him not to interfere. Li Yi had listened to the county magistrate's detailed explanation on the way here. It was nothing more than a fight between two young people. From verbal conflict to physical conflict, it developed into a chaotic fight. In the process, the brothel was smashed, which attracted the attention of the county government. When Li Yi and Li Xian walked into the county government, the two families were already there. It was not appropriate for the elders to interfere in the affairs of the younger generation. The Li family sent the current housekeeper. Li Yi also knew the Wang family. It was the next head of the Wang family, Wang Yong. These days, he had been repeatedly pushed to the front by the Wang family. It seemed that the position of the head of the family was already stable. Wang Yong naturally knew Li Xian. He hurriedly stood up and said respectfully, Wang Yong greets Your Majesty. Your Majesty. As soon as his words came out, the people present all knelt down. Li Xian waved his hand and said, I just came to take a look. Get up, the case should be solved as it should be. Wang Yong nodded his head respectfully before turning to look at Li Yi. With an apologetic look on his face, he said, Brotherly, I've caused trouble for you today. Wang Jian is the son of my second uncle, and he doesn't know the immensity of the heavens and earth. When I return, I'll definitely get my second uncle to discipline him more strictly. As for the damage to the brothel, the Wang family will definitely compensate for it. Li Yi waved his hand and said, Brother Wang, you don't have to be like this. It's normal to be young and impetuous. You and I have experienced this before. I've already asked County Magistrate Lu about it. Both of them are at fault. How can Wang Zhechuan bear the loss of the brothel? As for the apology, don't mention it again. Wang Yong knew his personality very well, so he didn't say anything. He nodded, then turned around, his face darkening. Hurry up and apologize. The authority of the substitute clan head was still very useful. A young man with messy clothes bowed to the person opposite him and said, "I'm sorry." The other person also bowed in apology. The junior of the Wang family was quickly brought back by the servants of the Wang family. Li Yingjie was also taken away by the steward of the mansion. It was originally a conflict between the younger generation of the two families, so no one would care. Wang Yong turned around and said with a smile, "A few days ago, my father said that he hasn't seen Brother Li for a long time. The tea that the Li family sent during the New Year festival is almost finished." Li Yi smiled and said, "If Lord Wang likes it, I'll have someone send some more another day." "No need for another day." Li Xian waved his hand and said, "It just so happens that Qin is at the Wang family these days, and I haven't been to the Wang family for a long time. How about today, Wang family?" The young man rubbed the bruise on his face and said with a displeased expression, "Big brother, why do you want me to apologize? It's not like I'm the only one in the wrong." A middle-aged man said with a sullen expression, "Who told you to have a conflict with the Li family?" The young man's expression became even more unconvinced. "So what if it's the Li family? Does the Wang family have to be afraid of the Li family? The empress's surname is Wang, and the Wang family is also a century-old clan. Other than Li Yi, what else does the Li family have? Why do we have to be afraid of him?" "Shut up." The Wang family master, who had been silent all this time, glared at him and said in a low voice, "You unfilial son, what are you saying?" The middle-aged man walked forward, raised his hand, and shook it helplessly. "Is this something you can say?" "It is." The young man curled his lips and said, "He is so young, yet he has so much power. Now, he even has to fight with eldest uncle for the position of prime minister. Since ancient times, people with such power have always been feared by the emperor in the end. No one has had a good ending. Now, the officials are very afraid of him. The emperor can't tolerate him for too long. If he knows what's good for him, he should retire early. Otherwise, I want to see what will happen to him in the end." "Shut up." A harsh voice resounded in everyone's ears, but it didn't come from anyone in the hall. Wang Yong walked in from outside. The young man opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but Wang Yong picked up the chair beside him and smashed it on the young man's head. The chair broke into pieces in an instant, which showed how much force Wang Yong used. The young man fell to the ground with a swollen face and a bloody nose, but he didn't faint. He looked at Wang Yong in disbelief and murmured, "You haven't said enough." Wang Yong glanced at him. When he picked up the second chair, everyone in the hall came back to their senses. The Wang family master stood up and asked in surprise, "Yong, what are you doing?" Wang Yong threw the chair down and shook his head. The emperor and County Marquis Li were outside just now. Hearing this, everyone's expression changed. The Wang family. Li Xian's face was gloomy and his eyes were filled with disappointment. Li Yi smiled and said unconcernedly, "He can't represent the Wang family." Li Xian suddenly looked at him and asked, "Do you think the officials really think this way?" "Think what?" Li Yi took a sip of wine and asked casually. "They think you have too much power and that I will be afraid of you." Li Xian stood up and said, "Since it's like this, I'll let them open their eyes and see." Li Yi had a bad feeling and asked, "What are you going to do?" "You'll know tomorrow," Li Xian said with a dark face and strode out of the door. A moment later, in the same place, Wang Yong's expression was complicated. He sighed and said, "Father has already told him to return to Luochuan. He will never set foot in the capital again in this life." Li Yi shook his head. "Why is this necessary? Sister will explain it to the emperor." Wang Yong lowered his head and said, "The Wang family will always be a friend of the Li family. Brother Li, don't think too much." The commoners and even the officials all thought that the Wang family was the largest family in the Jing kingdom. With the Wang family's power, they could do whatever they wanted in the Jing kingdom without fear. The Cui family thought the same back then, so the Cui family died out. From then on, he knew that some people could only be friends and not enemies. Wang Yong came to apologize on behalf of the Wang family and brought a very generous gift. Li Yi had to accept this gift. If he didn't accept it, it would be a rejection and a falling out with the Wang family. He was just an arrogant playboy and couldn't represent the Wang family. Li Yi knew this very well. Moreover, this gift was very expensive and it wouldn't be easy to return it. Li Yi saw Mingzu in the afternoon. "What happened to you and the Wang family?" Mingzu walked in from outside and said in surprise, "The Empress asked me to tell you that today's matter wasn't what the Wang family wanted." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "It's just a misunderstanding." Mingzu looked at him and asked doubtfully, "Then what are you worried about?" Li Yi sighed and said, "Li Xian." Chapter 979. When the previous emperor was on the throne, he was diligent in governing the court. Unless he was seriously ill or under special circumstances, morning court was rarely interrupted. Although the current emperor was not as diligent as the previous emperor, morning court was still held every day. It was just that the person presiding over the morning court was changed to the eldest princess. The civil and military officials were used to this. It was not strange to not see the emperor during morning court, but it was strange to see the emperor. Thus, when they stood neatly in the court and saw the eldest princess and the emperor walk out from both sides, they were a little surprised. Today was not the first day of the lunar year, nor was it a special day. It was rare for the emperor to come to court. As for whether the emperor regretted his previous slacking, it was not something the officials could guess. After the slight surprise, the morning court was held as usual. An official from the Academy of Sciences reported in detail the recent research progress of the Academy. The Minister of Rights advised the emperor to expand the harem to stabilize the foundation of the country. A senior censor said that the prime minister could not be left vacant. The current prime minister of Qin was old, and a new prime minister had to be chosen as soon as possible. The emperor highly praised the research of the Academy of Sciences and ignored the Minister of Rights. He looked at the officials and slowly said, "I already have a candidate in mind for the prime minister position. There is no need to say more." Many people in the court felt bitter when they heard this. They said more because the emperor already had a candidate in mind. The candidate he had in mind was really not suitable for the position of prime minister. Li Xian looked at the eunuch beside him and slowly said, "Announce the decree." "Yes, your majesty." The eunuch nodded respectfully and took out an imperial decree. He walked forward and glanced at the officials below. It was this one glance that caused everyone to feel a sense of foreboding. At this moment, the eunuch's shrill voice came from above. "The imperial decree." Countless people's hearts sank when they heard the word imperial edict. The wording of the imperial decree was very particular. The wording was different depending on the content. There were three main types: imperial decree, regulation, and imperial decree. Imperial decree was used to reward and also to warn. Regulation was used to announce to the officials and express the emperor's favor. As for imperial decree, it was used to announce to the world that it was not used unless it was an important matter. The emperor used imperial decree to appoint a crown prince and a princess. More importantly, there was no need for an imperial edict to be conferred the title of prime minister. The Marquis of Chang and County, Li Yi, is intelligent and has made great achievements. Since the early years of Jinghe, he created Tian Fa, offered horseshoes, changed interrogation by torture, repelled the enemy, opened the school of mathematics, and stopped the flood. The eunuch was still reading aloud. The ears of the hundreds of officials in the hall were buzzing. Marquis Li Yi of Chang and County. Sure enough, sure enough. As expected, His Majesty did not listen to his advice and insisted on making County Marquis Li the Prime Minister. He would be the youngest prime minister in the history of the Jing kingdom, and the laziest prime minister. Immediately, the faces of several censors and old officials changed. They stood out from the crowd. Before the imperial edict was finished, they were not allowed to interrupt. Otherwise, it would be a serious crime. But at this moment, everyone could see the determination on their faces. Get rid of the vermin, sweep away the crooks, push forward the reforms. Your contributions are great. Confer the title of Jiang of Silla to show the grace of the heavens. Pass it on forever. Take it and rest. Brilliant. The eunuch's voice was still echoing in the hall. Inside the hall, the expressions of some people finally relaxed. Not the prime minister. It turned out that it was just to confer the title of Jiang of Silla, not the prime minister. It seemed that His Majesty was still, Jing. Jiang of Silla. One word king. Jing was the title of the Jing kingdom. Jiang of Silla had always been the most respected prince. Since decades ago, there had been no Jiang of Silla in the royal family. Now, His Majesty conferred this title to a person with a different surname, a person who was not from the royal family. This was ridiculous. This was the biggest joke in the world. Mingsu looked at Li Xian, who had a serious face. Her lips moved, but she did not say anything in the end. Your Majesty. Your Majesty, please think twice. It is against the ancestral rules for a foreign official to be conferred the title of king. Your Majesty, please think twice. The imperial court was in an uproar. Countless officials knelt down and said loudly, I have made up my mind. Li Xian waved his hand and walked out from the side. A eunuch said loudly, court dismissed. Prime Minister Shen, say something. Lord Wang, we can't let His Majesty act willfully. Lord Yang, please go and see the Empress Dowager. We can't let His Majesty act so willfully. Princess, Your Highness, please persuade His Majesty again. After the officials got up, they immediately placed their last hope on a few important officials. The head of the Wang family sighed. He knew why His Majesty would do this, so he also knew that His Majesty would not retract this imperial edict. An old man shook his head and said, His Majesty is different from the late emperor. At this time, no one can say anything. Prime Minister Shen looked out of the palace with his murky eyes and murmured, No, there is one more person. His Majesty will definitely listen to his words. In a certain palace in the imperial harem, Wang Qin brought a cup of tea and put it in front of Li Xian. She said softly, My husband, don't be angry, they said I was suspicious of him. Li Xian held her hand and asked her to sit aside. Then he sighed and said, Qin, do you think he can understand what I did? Wang Qin sighed, but she could only sigh. There were some things that even if she could see clearly, she couldn't explain to him. He was worried that County Marquis Li would overthink because of the rumors outside, but he didn't know that the more he thought like this, the worse his situation would be. Today, not only the imperial court was in an uproar, but even the common people were also in an uproar in a very short time. Since His Majesty ascended the throne, County Marquis Li's power had reached its peak. Since ancient times, such officials never had a good ending. Not only the officials in the imperial court, but also the common people in the capital were guessing that it wouldn't be long before His Majesty began to suspect him. The decline of the Li family was a foregone conclusion. Who would have thought that after such a short period of time, His Majesty would give all of them a resounding slap in the face? Jiang of Silla, king of the one word, a foreign official being made a king. Since the founding of the country, no foreign official had ever received such an honor. Although County Marquis Li's achievements were great and no one in the imperial court could compare to him, in the end, he didn't have the merit of opening up territory. If he led troops to destroy the Qi kingdom or the Zhao kingdom, it would be understandable if he was made a king. But now, he was too young. This emperor's favor was a bit too much. Just like that, he was made a king of the one word. The emperor had directly expressed his attitude. In the future, who in the entire capital would dare to provoke the Li family? The Li family. The head of the family being made a king was a great honor. The entire manor was in jubilation. Li Yi had just sent off the worried old woman and sat back in the courtyard. He rubbed his slightly swollen head when the princess walked in from outside. He sighed and said, "Didn't we agree to have you stop him?" Mingzi shook her head and said, "You know that no one can stop him if he wants to do something. Why do you have to stop me?" Li Xian walked out from the back and said, "You have done so much for the Jing kingdom and the world. What is a mere king? Have you not counted how many foreign officials have been made kings since the founding of the Jing kingdom?" Li Yi shook his head and said, "You don't care what the court officials think or what the people think. I don't care what they think." Li Xian looked at him and said seriously, "I only care what you think." Chapter 980. Li Yi knew what Li Xian was thinking, but he didn't know that he would actually do this. Jiang of Silla, king of the one word, was practically the person with the highest status in the Jing kingdom, other than the emperor. This was what it meant to be under one person and above millions. He didn't try to persuade Li Xian to retract the edict, because what was more influential than a foreign official being made a king was to retract the edict after being made a king. Normal people understood that a gentleman's words cannot be retracted by 4 horses, and as an emperor, his words were even more important. Li Xian didn't care about this at all. He said, "Don't worry, if the officials object, I will take responsibility." At this moment, it was too late to say anything. He knew Li Xian's personality better than anyone else. Li Yi shook his head and said, "Let's not talk about this, let's drink." The wine was made by Xiao Zhu. Xiao Zhu's wine had 2 characteristics. One was that it tasted sweet, and the other was that it went to the head easily. Li Xian gulped down 2 cups and started to sway. "Tell me, what's so good about being an emperor and a prince? Why are there so many people fighting to the death?" Li Xian's eyes were hazy from drunkenness. He murmured, "I still feel that those days in Qin and prefecture were the most comfortable, the most carefree." Li Yi actually wasn't in the mood to drink. Today's events, Li Xian had only started. The troublesome things were still to come. "I know you don't want to be a prince, but I want to shut their mouths." Li Xian slapped the table and suddenly said, "This capital is not interesting at all. Why don't we run? Didn't you say that there's a fun place near Shuzhou that no one can control? Why don't we go there?" Li Mingzi looked at the 2 people beside her and shook her head slightly. The person who least wanted to be an emperor had become an emperor, and the person who least wanted to be a prince had become a prince. Sometimes, things in this world were so ironic. She stood up and lightly tapped Li Xian's shoulder. He immediately fell asleep on the table. She sat back down and looked at Li Yi, asking, "What should we do now?" Ever since Li Xian succeeded to the throne, Li Yi had been aware of certain things. However, he hadn't expected that Li Xian's sudden action would push a certain contradiction to the peak. "I don't know." He shook his head, looked at her and asked, "Are you hungry? I'll cook you a bowl of rice." "I'm not hungry." Mingzi shook her head. "1 egg or 2? 2. Reincarnation was a technical job. If one was born in the family of an emperor, king, general, or minister, they would not have to worry about food and drink for the rest of their lives. They would enjoy endless glory, splendor, and wealth. If they were born in a commoner's family, they would be born a notch lower than others. They would need to put in more hardships and effort than those people to earn a good future, but they might not be able to catch up to those people. Among these, the best situation was to reincarnate into the family of an emperor. Without any effort, they would be born princes and princesses. Children born in poverty might be able to change their fate with hard work and become a general and minister, but their birth had already determined that the highest they could achieve in this life was to become a general and minister. If they wanted to go one step further, they could only pray for a good reincarnation in their next life. However, there was always an exception. Yesterday's County Marquis Li and today's Jiang of Silla had created a precedent that had never been seen since the founding of the Jing Kingdom. There was a lot of discussion among the people. Other than expressing surprise, there wasn't anything else. On the imperial edict, the achievements of Jiang of Silla over the years were clearly written. In these years, many good changes had happened around them. People could almost see the shadow of Jiang of Silla in almost everything. He was made an exception to be conferred the title of king. It was unexpected, but also reasonable. There were not many objections from the people. However, because of this matter, the court and the royal family had a very tense relationship with the current emperor. There was no need to talk about the royal family. They all came from the Li family. How could they easily allow an outsider to interfere? Led by a few old members of the royal family with the surname Li in Jingdo, they protested to the emperor. The princes outside had not received the news, but presumably, they would not agree. In the court, there were already some complaints about the emperor's stubborn insistence on making County Marquis Li of prime minister. Now, the emperor did not make him prime minister and directly made him a king. In the future, when the prime minister saw him, he would also have to bow, following an emperor who would flip the table at the slightest disagreement. It was really a headache. Whether it was the people, the court, or the royal family, Li Yi did not pay attention to any of them. After being conferred the title of king, he did not even invite guests to celebrate. There was no difference from the past. If one had to go into detail, there was still a difference. In the past, it was very leisurely at home. Now, he had to look after 3 children at the same time, Li Duan, Yongning, and Shaoning. The 3 of them could not even handle it. He couldn't help but imagine his future and couldn't help but worry. Of course, Shaoning was no longer a child. Many times, she could help him look after the children. This was a very good change. Fong stood behind him with some confusion and asked, "Son-in-law, do we really not need to change the signboard on our door?" Li Yi waved his hand. "No need. I have no choice but to change it." Old Fong shook his head and said, "Son-in-law is now a prince, so the entrance can't be so shabby. We have to change 2 bigger stone lions, and the plaque should also be changed. Let's talk about it later." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Is there anything important these few days?" "Important?" Fong scratched his head and said, "The important thing is that you have been conferred the title of Jiang of Silla. There seems to be nothing else." "Right, yesterday, the Baldy sent a letter. He said that he now has a lot of people under him. They have built a city in the mountains. I don't know the specifics. These things are all managed by Second Mississippi. If son-in-law wants to know, I can go to Second Miss to get the information." Fong got up and left. Soon, he came back and said, "Son-in-law, there is an old man outside looking for you." The old man who came to find him should be one of the most powerful old men in the Jing Kingdom. Li Yi stood up and walked to the front hall. He cupped his hands to the old man who was waiting in the hall. "I didn't know that Prime Minister Shen was coming. I didn't go out to greet you." Prime Minister Shen stood up and bowed in return. He said, "This old man can't accept a bow from Jiang of Silla. The Li family and the Shen family could be considered to have some friendly relations." Prime Minister Shen had stood behind him several times in the court. He had people serve good tea, and after chatting for a while, he opened his mouth and asked, "Right now, only Prime Minister Shen is supporting the court. You should be very busy. How come you have the time to come here to drink tea?" Prime Minister Shen smiled and shook his head. He said, "This old man didn't come here to drink tea with Jiang of Silla." He put down the teacup and said, "Although Jiang of Silla is not in the court, I think he should know about the situation in the court these days." Li Yi didn't deny it. Prime Minister Shen raised his teacup and said with a smile, "This old man hasn't thanked Jiang of Silla for Su Su's matter." He was talking about Shen Su disguising herself as a man and sneaking into the Mathematics Academy. Li Yi suddenly realized that Prime Minister Shen had always kept a low profile in the court. He was the complete opposite of Prime Minister Qin and belonged to the gentle faction. But at their age, which one of them who could get to this position was not an old fox? The matter between Shen Su and Li Xian, whether it was unintentional or the Shen family intentionally pushed it, was ultimately the Shen family who benefited. He couldn't help but look at the old man in front of him in a new light. Li Yi didn't respond, and Prime Minister Shen didn't continue on this topic. He looked at him and slowly said, "I think Jiang of Silla knows His Majesty's temperament better than anyone else. His Majesty has fallen out with the court officials and clan members this time. The court is not stable. If this continues, there will be great losses. Only you can persuade His Majesty." Li Yi looked at him and asked, "What do you want me to do?" Prime Minister Shen shook his head. "This old man doesn't know what to do, but I know that His Highness Jiang of Silla definitely knows. You are not me." "How do you know that I know?" "Jiang of Silla is also not me." "How do you know that I don't know?" If he continued to ask, he would be suspected of exaggerating the number of words. Li Yi shook his head and didn't want to argue with the old man in front of him. There were some things that everyone was well aware of. At this point, he couldn't say any more. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.